Hello, my dear wanderers. It's Soren. Welcome back. Tonight we journey to the high ridges of the Andes, where the air thins and the clouds drift like slow rivers across the peaks. Lantern light feels faint here, replaced by the pale shimmer of snow, while footsteps press carefully into paths that vanish beneath drifts. The wind carries both silence and story, moving over terraces, rope bridges, and frozen spans that wait like temporary doorways across the mountains. Each crossing is fragile, yet each one links valleys and lives together, holding the rhythm of trade and prayer above the clouds. So, before you drift into sleep, take a moment to like and subscribe. Only if this brought you calm, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now dim the lights, take a deep breath, and let's drift into tonight's journey together. High above the tree line, where the thin air leaves most visitors dizzy, and where the snow clings to stone ridges, even in midsummer, human beings have found ways to survive, to travel, and sometimes to build improbable little pockets of civilization. The Andes, stretching like a jagged spine down the western edge of South America, offered both promise and punishment to those who dared to live among its peaks. There were potatoes, alpacas, silver, and sacred landscapes. There was also frostbite, avalanches, and the kind of cold that makes a person question their life choices. Into this contradictory environment stepped the Inca and the people before them, crafting ways to cross gorges and glaciers, to link valleys and plateaus, and to knit together an empire that was both fragile and astonishingly resilient. When we talk about snow bridges, we are not referring to decorative landscaping or Instagram-ready tourist spots. A snow bridge in the Andes was often a literal sheet of compacted ice and snow that formed across a crevasse or stretched across a torrent, becoming, for however long it lasted, the only connection from one side to the other for the communities who relied on such crossings. The bridges were both lifesavers and potential death traps. They were natural creations, but people learned to trust them, sometimes too much. Anyone who has spent time in high-altitude mountaineering knows that a snow bridge can look solid while hiding a deadly hollow beneath. Ancient Andean travelers didn't have carbon fiber poles or fancy crampons. They had wool, sandals, and a lot of misplaced optimism. Still, life went on. Trade routes wound up and over passes higher than the Alps, carrying dried fish from the Pacific, coca leaves from subtropical valleys, and salts from hidden flats. Llamas served as pack animals, though not very patiently. One imagines the herders muttering under their breath as the animals balked at another steep incline, because llamas have a reputation for spitting when annoyed, and the Andes offered endless opportunities for annoyance. Caravans crept across glaciers and snowfields, inching their way from one settlement to another, guided by knowledge passed down through generations. Where nature's bridges of snow failed, humans invented alternatives. Rope bridges spun from plant fibers, swinging dramatically above icy rivers. These were not crossings for the faint of heart. Even the most stoic noble probably clutched his cloak a little tighter while stepping onto one. The Andes had always been a place of extremes, and extreme environments tend to produce extreme solutions. One of the more fascinating aspects of Andean highland life was how thoroughly the people there adapted their bodies and cultures to the altitude. The Inca didn't just build cities like Cusco at heights that would leave most outsiders wheezing. They also developed agricultural terraces that squeezed every bit of productivity from the thin soil. Farmers constructed stone walls along steep hillsides, creating flat steps where potatoes, maize, and quinoa could grow. The terraces held moisture, prevented erosion, and made survival possible in landscapes that seemed almost designed to discourage human persistence. Snow bridges were just one piece of this broader puzzle of adaptation. They symbolized both the temporary triumph of humans over geography and the constant risk of nature's reversal. Travelers in the Andes often carried offerings for the mountain spirits, known as Athos. The snow peaks were not seen as indifferent geological features. They were personalities with moods, preferences, and grudges. To cross a snow bridge without some kind of ritual would have felt reckless. A handful of coca leaves scattered into the wind, or a small libation poured onto the ground, served as a gesture of respect. It is easy to imagine the weary traveler stopping before a treacherous crossing, muttering a quiet prayer, and then stepping gingerly onto the frozen surface. Some crossings held, some did not. But the relationship between people and mountains was maintained with solemn consistency. Among the elites of Andean society, there was an entire layer of drama layered on top of the snow and stone. The rulers of the Inca Empire, known as the Sapa Inca, lived in palaces of fine stonework at Cusco and later at other centers like Quito. They claimed descent from the sun itself, which is a bold family tree to maintain. The Sapa Inca's relatives, by custom, often married within the family to keep that divine lineage suitably pure. This was not unusual in royal circles worldwide. Egyptian pharaohs did the same, but in the thin air of the Andes, it meant dynastic politics that were both claustrophobic and unstable. Cousins married cousins, half-siblings married half-siblings, and over time the family ties twisted into something less like a tree and more like a tangled root system. While ordinary Andean villages dealt with snow bridges and terraces, the noble households of Cusco faced their own hazards: jealousy, rivalry, and succession disputes. An empire built on such precarious foundations often found itself in turmoil the moment a ruler died. Each son of the Sapa Inca, especially those born to high-status wives, considered himself a candidate for power. The palace became less a home and more a pressure cooker. Snow bridges might collapse suddenly and without warning, but so too did political alliances in Cusco's court. Consider the case of Huayna Capac, one of the later Inca rulers, who extended the empire into what is now Ecuador. He had many wives and many sons, a fact that would eventually prove more problematic than helpful. When he died, probably in the early 16th century, and possibly from disease introduced by early European contact, his empire fractured between his sons, Atahualpa and Huascar. The result was a civil war that weakened the Inca state. At the very moment Spanish conquistadors arrived, one can almost picture the two brothers glaring across the frozen valleys, each claiming legitimacy, while their followers dragged supplies over perilous snow crossings to fuel a conflict that would leave both losers in the end. If dynastic squabbles at the top seemed remote from the life of the shepherd or farmer clinging to an Andean slope, the consequences eventually reached everyone. Armies moved along the same trails that caravans used, trampling terraces and consuming stores of food. Snow bridges that once carried quiet processions of herders suddenly groaned under the weight of warriors and their supplies. The Atbus, one imagines, were not impressed. Yet, despite the turmoil, Andean society managed feats that still leave modern observers blinking in disbelief. The famous site of Machu Picchu, perched like an eagle's nest above the Urubamba River, demonstrates the kind of stone engineering that defies both earthquakes and common sense. Its builders didn't have iron tools, wheels, or draft animals capable of hauling heavy loads, yet they managed to fit stones together so precisely that a knife blade cannot slip between them. Reaching such sites often required traversing snow-covered passes and narrow trails that would have terrified anyone with a fear of heights. The sense of isolation of being suspended between earth and sky, only heightened the mystique. The human response to the Andes was not only physical and architectural, but also spiritual. Rituals were layered onto nearly every activity, from planting potatoes to crossing a mountain path. Perhaps the most haunting practice was kapesako, the offering of children to the gods, carried to high peaks and left in the snow. The remains discovered centuries later are eerily preserved by the cold, looking less like mummies and more like sleeping children. It is a reminder that snow bridges were not only practical crossings, but part of a world where snow itself was sacred, terrifying, and transformative. The mountains gave, and the mountains demanded. While European chroniclers often wrote with disdain or bafflement about Inca practices, it is worth noting that those same Europeans struggled mightily with the altitude and terrain. Horses wheezed, armor grew heavy, and men accustomed to lowland battles found themselves stumbling along cliffside paths where one wrong step meant a plunge into the void. Snow bridges that local herders treated as routine crossings became terrifying obstacles for outsiders. To an Inca noble, raised in Cusco's thin air and steep streets, the Spanish invaders must have looked like overstuffed tourists, clanking awkwardly through landscapes that didn't want them. As time drifted forward, the conquest brought its own layers of irony. Spanish rulers, many of whom had their own dynastic tangles back in Europe, imposed themselves on an empire already cracking under the strain of sibling rivalry. Colonial governors and encomenderos took over the palaces and terraces, while the common people still faced the same unforgiving snows and cliffs. Snow bridges remained what they had always been: fleeting, fragile, and necessary. The locals continued to cross them because there was no choice, while European elites preferred to build stone spans where possible, if only to avoid putting their silk-stockinged feet on something as unreliable as frozen water. The story of the Andes, then, is a mixture of survival and spectacle. Elites squabbled in their palaces, convinced of their divine right and entangled in their own family dramas. Villagers trudged across snow bridges with llamas in tow, hoping the surface held, and the mountains, cold and unimpressed, loomed above it all. Life above the clouds was never easy, rarely fair, and always precarious, which in a quiet way is the perfect setting for royal eccentricities and human stubbornness to flourish side by side. Sliding further along those cold ridges, we find that snow bridges were not only features of geography, but also quiet metaphors for the way Andean elites balanced their own precarious lives. Every dynasty that ever thought itself eternal eventually learned how temporary its structures could be, much like the frozen spans that connected one side of a gorge to another until the sun decided otherwise. The Inca emperors liked to imagine permanence. Their palaces were designed with blocks of stone so carefully fitted that earthquakes could shake the ground without toppling the walls. They staged ceremonies meant to convince subjects that the empire was blessed by the heavens and destined to last forever. Yet the reality beneath the ritual was shaky. The line of succession, despite its aura of divine clarity, was in fact a tangled mess of competing mothers, sons, and half-brothers. The official narrative was simple. The new Sapa Inca inherited the son's mantle from his father. The unofficial practice was much noisier, endless jockeying among siblings, factions forming within court, and whispers drifting through Cusco's narrow streets about who would end up wearing the royal fringe. One of the most memorable dynastic crises came after the death of Pachacuti, the so-called reformer king, who had transformed Cusco from a regional power into the core of a sprawling empire. Pachacuti's successors had to live under his looming shadow, A bit like inheriting a family business where the founder still seems to haunt the office. His son, Tupac, in Konki, carried the empire into new territories, and his grandson Huayna Capac expanded further. But by the time Huayna Capac passed, the imperial house was weighed down by too many heirs and not enough agreement. The split between Atahualpa and Huayzgar was just the loudest expression of a pattern that had always lurked beneath the surface. Within the palaces of Cusco, the elite families who supplied wives and concubines to the Sapa Inca played their own complicated games. A favored wife could raise her children's chances of inheriting power, while rivals might try to undermine her standing through carefully dropped rumors or subtle alliances. Cousin marriages and sibling pairings created overlapping networks of loyalty that were, in practice, networks of resentment. A snow bridge might hold steady for weeks and then collapse without warning. The same could be said of the palace coalitions that held up an emperor. Ordinary life under these rulers was less glamorous. Villagers on windswept plateaus endured hunger years when frost killed the crops, and they relied on communal storehouses stocked with dried potatoes and maize. The system worked remarkably well, but it also reinforced the empire's control. The granaries were state-run, and distribution could be adjusted to reward obedience or punish dissent. A family that resisted conscription into road building or army service might find its ration cut. In this way, the empire stretched its authority into every valley and hillside. To cross a snow bridge was a personal risk. To cross the political bridges of the Inca state was to risk offending rulers who saw themselves as children of the sun. Among the higher-ranking nobles, eccentricities flourished in ways that might seem comical from a distance. Nobles paraded in garments woven from the soft wool of the cunyas, animals so prized that only the ruler and a handful of chosen elites were allowed to wear their fiber. These garments were used once and then ceremonially burned, a practice that seems extravagant even by royal standards. Imagine the tailor's collective sigh as weeks of weaving went up in smoke simply because protocol demanded it. Ceremonial feasting was another stage for elite performance. Dignitaries gathered in Cusco or other centers, consuming quantities of chicha, a fermented maize drink that left the line between ritual and revelry pleasantly blurred. While villagers in remote valleys sipped cautiously from their gourds, elites toasted endlessly under the gaze of golden idols. The palace walls echoed not with laughter exactly, but with the sound of men convinced of their own importance, trying to outdo each other's toasts. One suspects the mountain spirits were quietly amused as Spanish chroniclers arrived and scribbled down their accounts. They often focused on these royal spectacles, missing the quieter threads of daily endurance. They were fascinated by the treasures of gold, the processions of nobles in elaborate headdresses, and the rigid ceremonies that filled Cusco's calendar. Less attention was given to the llama caravans plodding across snowfields, guided by herders who knew exactly how fragile those icy crossings could be. Yet, without those caravans, the empire's glittering court would have starved. The wealth of Cusco, with its fountains and gardens, depended on the steady flow of goods, dragged over treacherous passes by people who did not wear golden ornaments, but who knew how to test a snow bridge with the butt of a staff before stepping forward. The irony, of course, is that both sets of bridges, those of ice and those of kinship, could fail with devastating speed. A thaw could open a hidden crevasse beneath the traveler's feet. A sudden death or a whispered accusation could open a rift in the imperial household, and once either kind of collapse began, repair was difficult. Nature does not glue a broken snow bridge back together, and dynasties do not mend easily. after blood has been spilled in the struggle for succession. When the Spanish arrived under Francisco Pizarro, they stumbled directly into the aftermath of one such collapse. Atahualpa had defeated Huascar, but the war had bled the empire white. Soldiers who might have defended the empire were exhausted or dead, storehouses depleted, and loyalties frayed. The bridges, both literal and metaphorical, had already been weakened before a single European horse set hoof in the Andes. The conquest, often dramatized as a swift toppling, was more like a final shove given to a structure already listing dangerously. The irony is that while snow bridges crumbled under the weight of caravans, the imperial bridge crumbled under the weight of too many sons, too many wives, and too much faith in divine lineage to solve human quarrels. And yet, amid all of this fragility, the Andes continued to shape lives with quiet persistence. Villagers still climbed narrow trails, still trusted frozen crossings, still prayed to the Apis before taking each careful step. The mountains outlasted emperors, just as they outlasted conquistadors, quietly indifferent to the ceremonies and proclamations carried out beneath their peaks, drifting deeper into the highland world. The focus turns from rulers and battles to the quieter rituals that defined Andean identity. For the people who lived in the shadows of those towering mountains, daily existence was stitched together with ceremonies, obligations, and small gestures of respect toward the unseen forces believed to govern the landscape. Snow bridges were not just ice, they were thresholds between the familiar and the unpredictable, and that made them sacred. Every traveler understood that the high peaks were inhabited by the Apis, the mountain spirits. These were not distant deities confined to some celestial plane. They were immediate presences, looming over fields, watching over herds, and when displeased, sending storms or avalanches as blunt reminders. To keep the Apis content, villagers offered coca leaves, chique, or small figurines. Sometimes these were left at the base of a peak, and sometimes they were carried upward on treks that tested lungs and legs alike. Even elite families in Cusco, despite their wealth and pretensions of solar ancestry, participated in this ritual economy. They may have worn gold masks and claimed descent from the sun, but they still knew better than to cross a mountain pass without scattering a few leaves to the wind. This relationship with the mountains also shaped how elites performed their authority. Festivals in Cusco, often synchronized with seasonal cycles that mirrored agricultural rhythms, elites staged elaborate ceremonies, not only to demonstrate their own power, but also to assure their subjects that the gods, spirits, and ancestors remained cooperative. These rituals required participation on a massive scale, with subjects summoned from distant valleys to witness the pageantry. For peasants who had trudged across snow bridges and slept in freezing shelters just to attend, the sight of nobles dressed in dazzling textiles must have been as surreal as it was exhausting. The empire demanded loyalty not only through force but through carefully choreographed displays of cosmic order. At times, these rituals took on unsettling dimensions. The Kapasaka ceremonies in which children were sacrificed on mountaintops illustrate the extreme lengths to which the empire went to maintain balance with the divine. Frozen mummies, discovered on peaks such as Lelemealako, remind us of the solemnity with which these rituals were carried out. The chosen children, often of noble birth, were considered pure and suitable offerings to the gods. They were not abandoned in fear or disdain, but honored as emissaries. The fact that their bodies remain so well preserved in the ice only deepens the sense of eerie stillness. For the elites who sanctioned such ceremonies, the message was clear: the empire could claim to manage the relationship between human beings and the snow-capped powers towering above them. Whether ordinary villagers shared that sense of reassurance is harder to say, though compliance was rarely optional. The snow bridges themselves could become stages for small, almost theatrical moments of devotion. A herder might pause before leading his llamas across, whispering a blessing and scattering leaves. A traveling merchant might pour a trickle of drink into the snow before daring to step forward. Each crossing was a rehearsal of faith, a recognition that survival depended not only on skill and caution, but on maintaining harmony with forces beyond comprehension. Elites echoed this pattern on a grander scale, transforming entire festivals into sprawling acts of collective reassurance. If we shift focus slightly to the domestic world of the nobility, a different kind of ritual emerges, one less cosmic, but no less rigid. Royal households were governed by rules that dictated who could marry whom, who could inherit, and who could claim legitimacy. The practice of sibling marriage among the highest ranks was presented as a way of imitating the divine pairings of celestial beings. In practice, it produced a small pool of eligible heirs locked in perpetual rivalry. Household politics resembled snow bridges again, outwardly strong, inwardly fragile, and liable to collapse under the strain of too many competing feet. Behind the stone walls of Cusco, noble women wielded influence that was subtle but significant. As wives, mothers, and sisters, they shaped the fortunes of their sons and nephews. Some became patrons of religious rituals. Others orchestrated alliances by arranging marriages within extended kin groups. A misstep could be costly. Just as one did not cross a snow bridge without caution, one did not cross a powerful matron without consequences. Chroniclers often ignored these dynamics, focusing instead on the deeds of male rulers, but the undercurrent of female influence was undeniable. Meanwhile, outside the palaces, commoners carried on with routines that made survival possible. The empire's system of meta, or rotational labor service, required households to contribute time to building roads, maintaining terraces, or serving in the army. Roads paved with stone stretched across mountains and valleys, weaving together an empire that had no wheels but compensated with astonishing footpaths. Snow bridges were incorporated into this network, temporary links that kept the system functioning. The irony was that while nobles in Cusco burned their vicuña cloaks after a single wearing peasants patched their sandals repeatedly to walk the same roads that made imperial grandeur feasible. This contrast between the fragility of empire and the endurance of its people becomes sharper when one remembers how quickly everything unraveled after the Spanish conquest. Within a few decades, many of the old ceremonies had been suppressed, and palaces had been repurposed as colonial residences or churches. The snow bridges still formed and collapsed with the seasons, indifferent to changes in political overlords. For villagers trudging across the ice, the empire's golden age may have felt less like a memory and more like one more episode in a cycle of rulers rising and falling, while the mountains remained eternal. As the colonial system took shape, elites who once claimed descent from the sun now negotiated their positions within a foreign hierarchy. Some adapted, marrying into Spanish families or serving as intermediary. Others lost everything, their lineages broken, not by fragile snow crossings, but by fragile alliances, in a new order that had little interest in preserving their status. The collapse of dynastic certainties echoed the collapse of icy bridges under the wrong weight. Through it all, the Andes continued to dominate life. The thin air, the freezing nights, and the sudden storms did not bend to human ambition. Even today, Hikers tread carefully across snow bridges on Andean peaks, aware that beneath the crust of ice yawns emptiness. It is an apt image for the dynasties that once ruled there, gleaming with ceremony and confidence, yet always one step away from collapse. Gliding along those icy ridges of memory, we noticed that the Inca elite had a particular fondness for immortality, or at least the illusion of it. They believed their rulers did not truly die. A sapper Inca might stop breathing, but his body remained in the palace, dressed in fine garments, propped on a throne, and treated as though he were still reigning. Attendants brought food, drink, and gifts, not because anyone expected the mummy to eat them, but because appearances mattered. The dead ruler still held property, commanded retainers, and received visitors. It was a bit like a board meeting where half the participants were technically corpses, though no one wanted to admit it. This system of keeping royal mummies created peculiar tensions in Cusco. Each deceased emperor's lineage continued to control his estate, lands, and servants, while the new ruler had to carve out fresh resources for himself. Unlike European monarchies, where death cleared the slate for the successor, Inca rulers had to share the city with their embalmed predecessors. Entire palaces were occupied by corpses, and living nobles had to shuttle between them, making offerings and maintaining traditions. Imagine the awkwardness of negotiating alliances while being watched over by an ancestor whose face was literally still present in the room. Snow bridges may have collapsed without warning, but the political bridges of Cusco sagged constantly under the weight of too many claimants, both living and embalmed. This arrangement also explains why expansion was so central to the Inca state. Each new ruler needed new land and new resources, because the old ones were locked into the estates of the mummified dead. Conquest was not just a strategy of glory, it was a necessity of inheritance. Without fresh territory, a ruler would have little to support his court. This hunger for land drove the empire's rapid growth, but it also created the conditions for exhaustion. By the time Huayna Capac extended Inca authority into what is now Ecuador, the empire was stretched across climates from desert coasts to Amazonian fringes. Supply lines ran over snow bridges, through valleys, and along rope bridges, straining under the weight of distance. Expansion had solved the succession problem temporarily, but it left the empire vulnerable to collapse when external forces appeared. The Spanish, when they arrived, could not quite believe what they saw. To them, the mummified rulers of Cusco seemed grotesque evidence of a civilization gone astray. They failed to grasp that the practice was not about death denial so much as about continuity. For the Inca, the ancestors were still part of the community, still part of the political order, and still deserving of ceremony. Removing them would have felt like breaking the chain that bound past and present. Snow bridges were fragile, but necessary crossings. Ancestor veneration was the same, risky, temporary, but essential to keep the empire stitched together. Of course, this arrangement made dynastic disputes even more complicated. Living brothers and cousins competed for power, while the estates of long-dead emperors still commanded loyalty. It was as if every inheritance case remained perpetually open, never settled, never closed. The city became a crowded stage where too many actors insisted on starring roles, or ordinary people. This meant endless obligations. Each mummy's household required labor and offerings, on top of the labor demanded by the living ruler. A villager who already carried supplies across snowfields might also be summoned to weave fine cloth for a royal corpse. Survival was hard enough in the high Andes. Serving both the dead and the living made it harder. From a modern perspective, this situation reads like satire, yet it worked until it didn't. The empire functioned for generations, its rituals respected and its roads maintained, despite the constant threat of collapse. The snow bridges, again, offer the perfect metaphor. Each year, travelers knew the bridges might fail, yet each year they stepped onto them anyway. Trust and necessity outweighed fear. In Cusco, nobles trusted the system of mummified continuity, even as it strained under its own contradiction. They set it forward because there was no other way to keep the empire moving. When the Spanish finally dismantled the cult of royal mummies, burning remains and scattering estates, it was more than sacrilege. It was a direct assault on the system that had bound the empire together. The new rulers understood enough to see that control of ancestors meant control of the present. By severing that connection, they destabilized what remained of Inca authority. Snow bridges melted, dynasties dissolved, and the empire shifted into memory. And yet, the mountains stayed. The Apus did not vanish. The snow still formed its treacherous arches, and villagers still paused to scatter coca leaves before stepping across. Life above the clouds has a way of reminding people that empires are temporary, but geography is eternal. The Inca nobles might have believed they were children of the sun, but the mountains had seen other dynasties rise and fall before them. They would see others again. Snow bridges creaked, cracked, and collapsed, but new ones formed with each winter. Cycle endured. Long after golden palaces had crumbled, sliding further into the highland world, the daily presence of death and ritual shaped how Andean elites managed their existence. To rule in Cusco was not simply to command armies or to oversee terrace farming. It was to live constantly under the gaze of the ancestors, of the Apus, and of an entire society structured around obligation. There was little privacy for rulers, and even less freedom. Every gesture was ceremonial, every meal was political, and every family arrangement was entangled with questions of legitimacy. Royal households were filled with concubines, attendants, and distant relatives, all of them watching one another closely. A new Sapa Inca might try to consolidate his power by favoring certain wives or promoting particular sons, but that inevitably offended someone else. The system bred suspicion, and suspicion bred rivalries that simmered behind palace walls. Snow bridges may have appeared solid until one set of footsteps pushed them past the breaking point. In much the same way, the seemingly stable harmony of Cusco's court could fracture overnight when alliances shifted. Ceremonial life kept the elites busy. Public appearances were staged with meticulous detail. The ruler wore garments so heavy with gold ornaments that walking unaided could be a challenge. Nobles followed in procession, their headdresses towering, their cloaks woven in rare patterns. Servants carried parasols or fans, but the highland chill often made such luxuries more symbolic than practical. Behind the solemnity, there was always the possibility of misstep, an insult delivered unintentionally, a ritual performed slightly off cue, a rival house interpreting hesitation as weakness. To stumble on a snow bridge was dangerous. To stumble in a ceremony could be just as costly in political terms. The food at elite banquets tells its own story. Potatoes, maize, and quinoa formed the staples, but the nobles indulged in roasted guinea pigs, fresh fish brought from the coast, and game animals from distant valleys. The empire's networks allowed Cusco to feast on foods gathered hundreds of miles away. It was a display of power, reminding everyone that resources from diverse landscapes flowed to the center. Yet one has to imagine that even the most gilded of dishes cooled quickly in the thin mountain air. Guests may have smiled politely while chewing on tough meat, their eyes wandering toward the chica jars to wash it down. The chicha itself created its own kind of ritual drama, brewed from maize and often prepared by women of high standing. It was poured generously at festivals and meetings. Drinking was both social and political. To refuse a cup could be taken as an insult, while to drink too much could expose weakness. Nobles walked a fine line, nodding gravely while their heads swam, trying to maintain dignity in a setting where slurred speech could shift alliances. As with so much in the Andes, the risk of collapse was always present, whether under the snow, in the palace, or at the banquet table. Amid all this formality, it is easy to forget that nobles were still human beings living in a challenging environment. They endured the same biting cold at night, the same thin air that made sleep difficult, and the same unpredictable storms. They may have had thicker cloaks and larger hearths, but the mountains did not soften their severity. Even emperors felt the shortness of breath on steep climbs. If a snow bridge collapsed, no amount of divine lineage could prevent a tumble into the gorge. The mountains treated everyone equally, whether peasant or prince. This environment shaped elite eccentricities. Some rulers became obsessed with omens, consulting diviners before making even modest decisions. Others retreated into ceremonies, multiplying rituals in the hope of keeping chaos at bay. There were nobles who hoarded exotic animals as curiosities, and others who demanded increasingly elaborate displays of loyalty. In each case, the impulse was the same: to create the illusion of control in a landscape that constantly reminded them of their fragility. The palace intrigues could be ruthless, but they were rarely loud. Much like the mountains themselves, the politics of Cusco operated with a kind of cold silence. Rivalries grew slowly, like frost creeping across stone. When open conflict did arrive, it was devastating, but most of the time the tensions simmered in whispers, side glances, and carefully orchestrated marriages. Elites had to navigate this frozen terrain with the same caution as a herder testing each step across a snow bridge. For commoners watching from a distance, the royal drama must have seemed both awe-inspiring and absurd. They carried stones to build terraces, harvested crops for the state, and marched in armies to expand the empire. They did not sit in golden halls debating succession, but they bore the weight of those debates. When rulers quarreled, it was villages that paid the price. Armies trampled fields, taxes increased, and snow bridges that once carried caravans of food were suddenly crowded with soldiers. The fragility of the empire's top layer trickled downward, spreading instability to those who had little say in the matter. Still, the rhythm of life continued. Fields were planted, llamas grazed, and villagers crossed snowy passes with baskets of goods strapped to their backs. The empire might fracture, palaces might tremble with intrigue, but the Andes remained. The snow bridges formed each winter, held for a time, and eventually gave way. People learned to live with that pattern, just as they learned to live with rulers who claimed the sun as their father, but who quarreled like ordinary siblings over inheritance. The fragility of succession became even sharper when the empire faced outside threats, and the Spanish invasion only highlighted how brittle the structure of Inca authority really was. When Atahualpa and Huasca tore the empire apart in their civil war, the roads that had once carried tribute and trade now carried armies loyal to one brother or the other. Snow bridges that villagers crossed with llamas and baskets were suddenly crowded with troops and messengers, their weight pressing down on already unstable crossings. The empire's strength had always rested on its roads, its labor system, and its ability to appear united under a single ruler. Once that illusion broke, the entire network trembled. Atahualpa, victorious in his war against Huasca, could not enjoy his triumph for long. Francisco Pizarro and his men arrived, bearing steel weapons and horses that seemed otherworldly to the Andean eye. The Spaniards, of course, were fewer in number, but they understood how to exploit fractures. They took Atahualpa prisoner at Cajamarca, and in that single move, the structure of the empire cracked beyond repair. No amount of ceremony or divine lineage could erase the sight of the Sapa Inca held captive by strangers. Nobles who had once bowed before him now weighed their options, wondering how to survive in this new, disorienting order. The famous ransom, paid in rooms filled with gold and silver, reveals the desperation of the Inca elite. They believed wealth could purchase stability, that precious metals could buy back their ruler and restore the empire's balance. The Spaniards, predictably, took the treasure and executed Atahualpa. Anyway, it was a moment of cold betrayal, though perhaps not so surprising, when one remembers that the empire itself had thrived on rituals of control and the illusion of permanence. Snow bridges look solid until they collapse. Atahualpa's power looked eternal until it was gone in an instant. For Huascar, still alive at the time of Atahualpa's capture, the story ended no better. He was executed on his rival brother's orders. A last attempt to consolidate legitimacy that only deepened the void. With both brothers dead, the empire had no stable heir. The court was a tangle of widows, sons, and half-brothers, none of them with uncontested claims. The Spaniards exploited this confusion, installing puppet rulers when useful and discarding them when not. The golden palaces of Cusco, once filled with processions and feasts, now echoed with foreign voices and foreign prayers. The nobles, stripped of their central authority, responded in different ways. Some collaborated, seeking to preserve fragments of their estates and influence under Spanish rule. Others resisted, leading uprisings in the highlands that sputtered into defeat against firearms and cavalry. Many simply endured, adjusting to a world where their rituals were outlawed and their ancestors' mummies destroyed. The cult of royal mummies, so central to Inca continuity, became a target for suppression. The Spaniards saw it as pagan superstition and a rival to Christian authority. They burned or buried the remains, severing the dynastic bridges that had once connected past and present. For the surviving nobles, this was a collapse as devastating as the loss of Cusco itself. And yet, even in this broken order, elements of the old ways persisted. Villagers continued to scatter coca leaves before crossing snowfields, whispering to the Apis, even as priests preached sermons in new churches built over Inca foundations. Families remembered which lineages had once married which cousins, even if those lineages now tilled land for colonial masters. The empire, as a political entity, was gone, but the habits of life above the clouds proved harder to erase. The Andes, as always, had the last word. From a distance, the fall of the empire looked swift and decisive, but for those who lived through it, the change must have felt uneven, patchy, and bewildering. One village might see Spanish soldiers march through, demanding tribute and baptisms, while another continued to follow old rhythms for years before the new order reached them. The snow bridges of the Andes had always been temporary, fragile, and risky. So too was every form of rule imposed on the highlands. The Spaniards might conquer cities and seize palaces, but they could not change the fact that travelers still had to trust their lives to thin crusts of ice, suspended above voids. The irony is that while the conquistadors dismissed Inca practices as strange or barbaric, they themselves were often reduced to the same struggles as the locals. Horses stumbled on mountain trails, Armor rusted in the cold, and soldiers coughed in the thin air. They depended on native guides to lead them across passes and snow bridges, the very features they found terrifying. For all their weapons and bravado, the Spaniards were just as vulnerable to the mountains' indifference. The Apus, silent and immovable, judged everyone equally. The Spanish conquest may have shattered the political heart of the Inca world, but life above the clouds carried on in ways that were less dramatic and more stubborn. Villagers still rose at dawn to tend to fields terraced into impossible slopes. They still wove wool into warm tunics, still herded llamas across ridgelines, and still paused before crossing snowfields to acknowledge the spirits of the peaks. Dynasties collapsed, rulers perished, and new masters arrived, but the cold winds and thin air of the Andes remained unchanged. For the surviving Inca nobility, adaptation was awkward and often humiliating. Families that had once claimed descent from the sun now presented genealogies to Spanish officials, hoping to secure titles and privileges under colonial law. Some were granted positions as local governors, their prestige preserved in exchange for loyalty. Others sank quietly into obscurity, their estates seized and redistributed. It was a strange inversion. Nobles who had once presided over elaborate rituals to maintain divine favor now petitioned bureaucrats with stamped documents. The grandeur of golden processions gave way to the slow grind of paperwork. The destruction of royal mummies cut especially deep. For centuries, the dead had been part of the living community, their estates functioning, their bodies dressed and displayed. To burn or bury them was to erase not only ancestors but active participants in politics and ceremony. Without them, the dynastic bridges that bound past and present disintegrated. Snow bridges collapse under heat and pressure, and so too did the fragile connections of Inca continuity when confronted with fire and foreign rule. Colonial authorities imposed Christianity, and churches rose where temples once stood. The Coricancha, Cusco's Temple of the Sun, became the foundation for a Dominican convent. But even as hymns replaced chants, traces of the old beliefs lingered. Villagers might kneel at the altar on Sunday, and then step outside to offer coca leaves to the mountains. For elites trying to navigate this dual world, the balancing act was delicate. Too much loyalty to the old ways invited punishment. Too much accommodation risked alienation from their own people. In the centuries that followed, rebellions flickered in the highlands, led sometimes by descendants of noble families who claimed legitimacy as heirs of the Inca. Most ended in defeat, crushed by colonial armies, but they testify to the persistence of memory. Even when snow bridges collapsed, new ones formed with each winter. The same was true of political dreams, broken in one generation, renewed in the next. The landscape itself encouraged endurance. Survival in the Andes had always required patience, resilience, and a willingness to step cautiously forward, even when the ground beneath was uncertain. The colonial period also introduced new ironies into elite life. Spanish governors and encomenderos, accustomed to Mediterranean climates, found themselves shivering in Cusco's cold nights, draping themselves in imported wool while simultaneously scorning the clothing of the locals. They dined on wheat bread and wine shipped across oceans, but they also depended on potatoes and quinoa grown on terraces older than their empire. The very foods they once dismissed became their staples when European crops faltered in the thin soil. In a quiet way, the land reminded them who was really in charge. For native elites who managed to retain influence, the colonial system offered both opportunities and dangers. Some married into Spanish families, blending lineages in ways that would have scandalized their ancestors. Others used their positions to shield their communities, negotiating tax burdens or protecting rituals from complete suppression. But the grandeur of the old dynasty was gone. There were no more golden processions of rulers carried through Cusco, no more feasts where nobles burned cloaks after a single wearing. The palaces still stood, but their stone walls echoed with foreign prayers and new masters. And yet, even in this diminished state, the memory of the Inca lingered. Villagers told stories of the lost emperor who would one day return. Travelers still crossed snowy passes, whispering to the Apis for safe passage. The snow bridges, temporary and fragile, endured as symbols of a world that could bend under pressure but never fully break. The empire might have fallen, but the rhythm of life above the clouds continued, steady and quiet, indifferent to the ambitions of rulers, whether Inca or Spanish. It is this contrast that makes the story of Andean elites so strange and so poignant. They lived in palaces of stone, wrapped themselves in textiles of impossible fineness, and staged ceremonies meant to project eternal power. And yet their lives were as Erebus as those of the herders, leading llamas across frozen arches of snow. Dynasties fractured, mummies burned, and titles evaporated. The mountains, cold and silent, outlasted them all. When we drift into the later echoes of this story, the picture becomes less about empires and more about memory. The Inca dynasty, with its tangled marriages and gilded ceremonies, had collapsed centuries before, yet its traces remained everywhere in the Andes. Terraces still cling to mountainsides, rope bridges still sway across rivers, and the shadows of stone palaces still dominate Cusco. Snow bridges, too, still form and collapse with the seasons, fragile reminders of a world where life is always balanced on uncertain ground. For descendants of the Inca nobility, the centuries following conquest were a patchwork of survival. Some families retained fragments of their old estates, becoming intermediaries in the colonial order. Others faded into obscurity, remembered only in oral traditions or local chronicles. Titles of nobility granted by the Spanish crown were small consolations compared to the grandeur of ruling. As children of the sun, a few noble lines tried to preserve their identity through careful genealogies, tracing descent from long-dead rulers as though paper records could replace the presence of embalmed ancestors once seated in Cusco's halls. These attempts at permanence were brittle, much like a snow bridge, useful for a time, but vulnerable to collapse when circumstances shifted. Meanwhile, the Andean villagers, who had always carried the empire on their backs, continued to live with quiet resilience. They grew potatoes in terraced fields, herded llamas along ridges, and kept their rituals alive beneath the watch of colonial priests. Their world was one of endurance rather than spectacle, though even endurance took on its own form of quiet grandeur. To survive winters at 14,000 feet is no small achievement. To keep faith with mountain spirits while outwardly adopting new religions requires a kind of patient irony that few empires ever master. The mountains, indifferent as always, kept shaping the rhythm of life. Travelers still placed coca leaves in the snow before stepping onto treacherous crossings. Shepherds still tested each step with their staffs, hoping the icy span beneath would hold. The Apis remained, whether worshipped openly or acknowledged in whispers. They had watched empires rise and fall before. They would watch again. In their presence, the drama of elites, marriages between half-siblings, feasts of roasted guinea pigs, ceremonies performed before golden idols faded into the background. The Apis neither approved nor condemned. They simply endured. Looking back, the story of the Inca elites feels almost like a long series of fragile bridges. Dynastic marriages tried to connect families but often collapsed into rivalry. The cult of royal mummies linked past and present, but was vulnerable to fire and conquest. Ceremonies held together a sense of order, but one misstep could unravel alliances. Even the empire itself was a kind of snow bridge, impressive, precarious, and destined to melt away when the weather turned. What remains is not the grandeur of the palaces, but the stubborn persistence of the people and the mountains that framed their lives. Life above the clouds has always carried this contradiction. It is at once harsh and beautiful, cruel and sustaining. The elites of the Inca world tried to master it with rituals, palaces, and claims of divine descent. They succeeded for a time, creating an empire that astonished outsiders and left traces still visible today. But in the end, their power dissolved as quickly as a snow bridge in spring sun. What endured was not their golden garments or their elaborate feasts, but the simple rhythm of planting, herding, and crossing the mountains with quiet caution. And so the story of the snow bridges of the Andes is less about triumph or tragedy than about balance. Human beings lived and died here. Rulers quarreled and dreamed of immortality. Dynasties built palaces and lost them. Yet the snow continued to fall, to pile, to arch across gorges, and then to collapse again. Above the clouds, permanence is an illusion. What matters is the patience to step forward carefully, knowing that nothing, not even empires, lasts forever. One tale may end, but history never leaves us empty-handed. The moment one door shuts, another creaks open, spilling out a stranger secret, a darker echo, and a path we can't resist following. This is the Hermits of Mount Athos, silent lives by the Aegean Sea. On the northeastern tip of the Greek peninsula, rising above the Aegean Sea, there is a place where time seems to stand still, a place where the hum of modern life fades into a distant memory. Mount Athos, a craggy and rugged peak, is home to one of the most isolated and spiritual communities in the world. It is not just a mountain, it is a living testament to a way of life that has persisted for over 1,000 years, far from the distractions and noise of the outside world. Here on this sacred mountain live the monks and hermits of the Athonite monasteries, men who have chosen silence, prayer, and solitude as their way of life. Mount Athos, often called the Holy Mountain, has long been regarded as a place of spiritual significance. The history of monasticism on the mountain dates back to the 9th century, when the first monasteries were founded. The monks who came to Mount Athos were drawn by the desire for spiritual enlightenment, seeking a life free from the material distractions of society. Over the centuries, the number of monasteries grew, and the mountain became a center of Orthodox Christian monasticism, with its own unique way of life and rules of conduct. But it's not just the monasteries that make Mount Athos so unique. It's also the hermits, the men who choose to live in solitude, often far from the bustling communities of the monasteries, seeking a deeper connection with God through isolation and silence. These hermits, living in small cells tucked away in the hills and valleys of the mountain, embody the ultimate ideal of asceticism, withdrawing from the world to focus solely on prayer, contemplation, and spiritual growth. Their lives are a far cry from the modern world, where noise and distraction are ever present. On Mount Athos, the silence is palpable, broken only by the sound of the wind, the call of birds, and the occasional chant of the monks in prayer. The monks and hermits of Mount Athos have long lived by a strict code of conduct, one that emphasizes humility, obedience, and self-denial. The monastic life on the mountain is built around the idea of constant prayer and the pursuit of inner peace. Each day is a rhythm of prayer, work, and contemplation, with little room for anything that might disturb the tranquility of the soul. The monks rise before dawn to begin their prayers, spending hours in the church, chanting hymns and meditating on the divine. Afterward, they turn to their daily tasks, farming, cooking, cleaning, or caring for the gardens. These simple, everyday activities are seen not as chores, but as opportunities for spiritual growth, moments to cultivate patience, humility, and mindfulness. The lives of the monks are marked by austerity. The monks of Mount Athos live in simple cells, furnished only with the barest necessities. They eat frugally, subsisting on a diet of vegetables, grains, and occasional fish. The monastery communities themselves are often self-sustaining, growing their own food, brewing their own wine, and producing their own incense. The monks wear plain robes and sandals, their clothing unadorned, reflecting their rejection of material wealth and comfort. It is a life dedicated to God, where every moment is an opportunity for worship, prayer, and spiritual reflection. But perhaps the most striking feature of Mount Athos is the silence. It is not merely the absence of sound. It is a conscious choice to embrace quietness, to remove oneself from the constant noise and distractions of the modern world. Silence on Mount Athos is not just about avoiding noise. It is about creating a space for God to speak. For the monks and hermits here, silence is sacred. It is through silence that they seek to deepen their relationship with the divine, allowing themselves to listen to the subtle whispers of God that might otherwise be drowned out by the noise of everyday life. The silence on Mount Athos can be overwhelming for those who are not accustomed to it. The first-time visitor may find it almost unnerving. The stillness that hangs in the air, the lack of conversation, the absence of the usual bustle of modern life. But for the monks, the silence is a source of peace, a refuge from the chaos of the outside world. It is in this silence that they find clarity, purpose, and spiritual connection. It is here, on the slopes of Mount Athos, that they believe they can draw closest to God, in a world where noise and distraction often drown out the sacred. The mountain itself, with its towering peaks and steep cliffs, is a place of natural beauty and spiritual significance. It is a landscape that seems to mirror the ascetic life of the monks, rugged, challenging, and isolated. The journey up the mountain is not an easy one. Visitors must pass through dense forests, rocky paths, and steep inclines before they reach the monasteries or the hermitages. The physical journey to Mount Athos is often seen as a reflection of the inner spiritual journey the monks undertake, a journey that requires perseverance, humility, and a willingness to endure hardship for the sake of spiritual growth. While the hermits of Mount Athos live in isolation, they are not completely cut off from the world. Pilgrims from around the world come to the mountain to seek spiritual guidance, to pray, and to experience the tranquility of the monastic life. Visitors must first obtain permission to visit the mountain, and their stay is usually limited to a few days. This helps to maintain the sanctity and seclusion of the mountain, ensuring that it remains a place of peace and quiet. The pilgrims who do visit often leave with a deep sense of reverence and awe, having experienced firsthand the peace and silence that reigns on Mount Athos. But for the hermits, the world beyond the mountain is a distant memory. They live as though time itself has slowed. Their days are measured by the hours of prayer and labor, their lives devoted entirely to God and their community of fellow monks. They live without the comforts of modern life, without the distractions of technology, entertainment, or the noise of city life. Their world is one of simplicity and stillness, a world where every action is imbued with meaning and purpose. It is a life that has been passed down through generations, one that remains remarkably unchanged, despite the passage of time and the encroachment of the modern world. To the monks and hermits of Mount Athos, their way of life is more than a choice. It is a vocation, a calling to live in the presence of God, to devote every moment to the pursuit of holiness. They have rejected the world, with all its temptations and distractions, in favor of a life that is focused solely on the divine. For them, Mount Athos is not just a mountain, it is a sanctuary, a place where they can draw near to God and live in the silence that allows for true spiritual growth. And while the outside world may change, the monks of Mount Athos remain steadfast, living their silent lives by the Aegean Sea, far from the noise and chaos of modernity. Mount Athos is not merely a peak rising above the Aegean Sea. It is an island unto itself, a place entirely dedicated to monastic life, where over 20 monasteries and countless hermitages are scattered across its slopes and valleys. The very geography of the mountain, with its rugged cliffs and dense forests, adds to the sense of separation from the outside world. To reach the heart of Mount Athos, one must first take a boat across the Aegean from the mainland of Greece. The sea journey itself, for many, becomes a pilgrimage, a crossing into another world where the noise of modernity is left behind and the sacred is allowed to take center stage. This isolation has long defined Mount Athos, shaping not only its spiritual identity, but also the lives of its inhabitants. The mountain is home to some 2,000 monks, living in a world where time is measured not by hours, but by the cycle of prayer and seasons. Each monastery and hermitage is self-governed, each with its own distinct traditions and customs, but all share the same fundamental commitment to the monastic ideal. The rules of the holy mountain are strict, and the day-to-day lives of the monks are framed by the rhythm of the liturgical calendar. Though the monasteries of Mount Athos may be different in size and structure, they all share a similar purpose. They are places of prayer, work, and silence. The monks rise early each morning, before the sun, for the first of their prayers. Matins, followed by a long day filled with various forms of worship, reading, and physical labor. The silence of the morning hours is broken only by the chanting of prayers, as the monks engage in their communal worship, which is central to their lives. Every prayer, every hymn sung, is part of a larger pattern, an offering to God, designed to sanctify the day. But while communal prayer is vital to monastic life, it is often the solitary lives of the hermits, those who live in isolation, that capture the imagination of those who visit Mount Athos or read about it. These hermits, scattered across the mountain, are often the most reclusive, living far from the monasteries and seeking an even more intense life of prayer and contemplation. Many hermits live in small stone cells built into the cliffs, with little more than a bed, a small altar, and a few personal belongings. Their lives are an embodiment of asceticism, a rejection of worldly comforts, and a total surrender to the pursuit of spiritual purity. The ascetic life is not easy. The hermits endure solitude for weeks, months, or even years, with little human contact beyond the occasional visit from a fellow monk or a pilgrim seeking spiritual guidance. Their days are spent in prayer, reading sacred texts, fasting, and performing manual labor. These solitary monks often live on meager diets, subsisting on the simplest of food: bread, vegetables, olives, and the occasional fish. Many of them wear simple robes, often patched and threadbare, a symbol of their detachment from the material world. They live in humble surroundings, with their cells often situated on the edges of cliffs or in hidden valleys, far from the larger monasteries. The hermit's isolation serves not just as a retreat from the world, but as a way to draw closer to God. It is through silence and solitude. The hermits believe that they can cultivate a deeper relationship with the divine without the distractions of the outside world. They are free to focus on the most important thing in their lives, their communion with God. The monastic rule of life on Mount Athos is not one of self-indulgence, but of self-denial. It is a way of emptying oneself of earthly attachments so that one may be filled with the presence of God. The solitude that the hermits experience on Mount Athos is not a loneliness born of isolation, but rather a choice for spiritual freedom. For many of the hermits, this solitude is a source of joy, a deep sense of peace and contentment that comes from being in God's presence. Their days are marked by long hours of prayer, the repetition of sacred texts, and the constant reflection on the mysteries of the divine. In their solitude, they experience a profound connection to the divine, a union that can only be achieved through withdrawal from the world and its distractions. Despite the apparent isolation, the hermits are not truly alone. They are part of a larger community, one that extends beyond the individual monasteries and hermitages of Mount Athos. The monks and hermits on the mountain are bound together by a shared purpose and a shared vision of the monastic life. The bonds between the monks, although often silent and unspoken, are deep and strong. There is a sense of mutual support and respect that exists between the communities, even if it is rarely expressed in words. In fact, the very nature of life on Mount Athos encourages a form of unity that is not based on external communication or interaction, but on a shared commitment to the spiritual journey. The monks and hermits are all striving toward the same goal, the purification of the soul and the attainment of divine grace. And though their paths may differ, their destination is the same. In this way, the community on Mount Athos exists not just in a physical sense, but in a spiritual one, where the monks and hermits support one another through prayer and through their shared commitment to the monastic ideal. Life on Mount Athos is also deeply tied to the cycles of nature. The monks and hermits on the mountain live in harmony with the land, cultivating gardens, tending olive groves, and raising livestock. The labor they perform is not only necessary for their survival, but also an act of prayer. Through their work, the monks learn to see the hand of God in all things, from the fruit of the earth to the animals they care for. The monastic life on Mount Athos, with its simplicity and self-sufficiency, allows the monks to immerse themselves in the rhythms of nature, where each season brings its own spiritual lessons. The landscape of Mount Athos itself is as much a part of the monastic experience as the prayers and the work. The jagged cliffs, the dense forests, and the rolling hills are not just beautiful scenery, they are a reflection of the inner journey of the monks and hermits who call this sacred place home. The landscape serves as a constant reminder of the mountain's spiritual significance. Each rock, each tree, each distant view of the Aegean Sea is an invitation to contemplate the divine. The monks, living in this remote and untouched wilderness, are reminded daily of the majesty and mystery of creation. But it is not just the monks and hermits who are drawn to Mount Athos. Pilgrims from all over the world make their way to this holy mountain, seeking solace, guidance, and spiritual renewal. For many, a visit to Mount Athos is not just a vacation or a sightseeing trip. It is a pilgrimage, a sacred journey to a place where they can step outside the distractions of modern life and reconnect with their faith. The pilgrims who visit Mount Athos are often struck by the stillness and tranquility that pervades the mountain. It is a place where time seems to slow, and where the pressures and anxieties of the modern world are temporarily forgotten. While the monks and hermits live their silent lives by the Aegean Sea, their example serves as a reminder of a different way of being in the world, one that values contemplation, humility, and spiritual growth over material wealth and success. Mount Athos is not just a physical location, it is a living symbol of the monastic ideal, where silence, solitude, and prayer are the guiding principles. In a world that is increasingly noisy and distracted, the monks of Mount Athos remain steadfast in their commitment to the quiet path, showing us all the power of silence and the peace that comes from living a life dedicated to the divine. To understand the lives of the hermits and monks of Mount Athos is to understand the rhythm of a day that moves in harmony with the natural world. Their lives are a series of well-practiced actions, each one carefully designed to keep their focus on the divine. Time on Mount Athos is not divided into the hours of the modern clock, but into moments of prayer, work, and reflection. The day begins before dawn, in the stillness of the early morning hours, when the world itself seems to be holding its breath. The monks of Mount Athos wake up early, often before the sun rises, to begin their first prayers of the day. It is a time of quiet, intimate connection with God, where each monk, whether in the communal chapel of a monastery or in the solitude of his cell, offers his prayers in the silence of the mountain. The first prayers of the day, matins, are a set of hymns and psalms that prepare the monks for the day ahead. These prayers are often chanted in a slow and deliberate manner as the monks enter a state of deep contemplation. The rhythm of their voices, the reverence of the words, and the serenity of the moment all combine to create an atmosphere of sacred stillness. After matins, the monks gather together for the divine liturgy, the central act of worship in the Orthodox Christian tradition. The divine liturgy is a communal event, one that binds the monks together in shared faith. This is the time when the monks come together as a community, putting aside their individual tasks to join in the most important ritual of their day. The liturgy itself is long, sometimes lasting several hours, and is marked by the chanting of hymns, the reading of scriptures, and the offering of the Eucharist. The air is filled with the incense of the church, the soft sounds of chanting, and the sacred presence of God. For the monks, this is the high point of their day, a moment of total devotion and surrender to the divine. After the liturgy, the monks turn to their work, though the focus of their lives is on prayer and contemplation. They must also engage in practical work to support themselves and their communities. The monasteries of Mount Athos are largely self-sufficient, and the monks spend much of their day tending to their gardens, caring for the animals, maintaining the buildings, or crafting goods for their daily needs. The work is seen not as a burden, but as an extension of their spiritual practice. By laboring with their hands, they are offering their efforts to God, making their everyday tasks into acts of devotion. The work of a monk is simple, but it is also demanding. For many monks, this includes farming, planting, and harvesting vegetables, olives, and grains. The monks grow their own food, relying on the land around them to provide for their daily needs. There is something deeply sacred about this connection to the earth, as the monks believe that by caring for the land, they are caring for the creation that God has entrusted to them. It is a humble but deeply meaningful way of life, where each task, no matter how small, is seen as an opportunity for spiritual growth. In addition to farming, the monks of Mount Athos also engage in crafts such as iconography, woodworking, and weaving. Iconography, the sacred art of creating religious images, is an especially important form of work on the mountain. Many monks on Mount Athos are skilled in the creation of icons, paintings of saints, Christ, and the Virgin Mary, that are used in the monasteries and sold to pilgrims. The process of painting an icon is considered an act of prayer in itself, and each stroke of the brush is seen as an offering to God. The monks take great care in their work, as the icons they create are more than just art. They are vessels of divine presence, meant to inspire prayer and devotion. While the monks are engaged in these practical tasks, they do not do so for the sake of efficiency or personal gain. Work on Mount Athos is not about producing more or making a profit. It is about serving the community and honoring God. For the monks, the work is part of their spiritual discipline, a way to channel their energy into something meaningful. Each task, whether it is planting a seed, preparing a meal, or making an icon, is an act of humility and love. Through their labor, they learn to live in the present moment, fully immersed in the task at hand, free from distraction or concern for the future. The midday meal is a quiet affair. The monks gather in the refectory, a simple dining hall where they share a meal in silence. There is no conversation during the meal. Instead, the monks focus on the food before them, giving thanks to God for providing it. The food is simple vegetables, bread, olives, and occasionally fish. The meals are designed to sustain the monks, but they are not indulgent. The emphasis is on moderation and humility. The meal is a reminder of the monks' vow of poverty and their commitment to live without excess. After the meal, the afternoon is often spent in continued prayer or work. The monks may retreat to their cells for private contemplation, or they may work together in the gardens, repairing buildings, or preparing for the evening service. In the quieter moments of the afternoon, many monks turn to reading sacred texts. The Bible is the primary text, but the monks also read works by the Desert Fathers, early Christian monks who wrote about the spiritual life, and other writings that help them deepen their understanding of God. These texts are not just for intellectual study, they are tools for spiritual growth, helping the monks draw closer to the divine. As the day comes to a close, the monks prepare for Vespers, the evening prayer service that marks the end of the day's liturgical cycle. Vespers is another time for the monks to come together in prayer, offering thanks for the day that has passed and seeking God's guidance for the night ahead. The service is shorter than the morning liturgy, but it is just as important. After Vespers, the monks may gather for a brief social time, sharing a simple meal or discussing spiritual matters. This is often the only time during the day when the monks engage in conversation, and even then it is done with an emphasis on humility and respect. The day ends as it began, quietly, with prayer. The monks retire to their cells where they continue their personal prayers and reflection before sleep. The night is spent in rest, but it is also a time for deeper spiritual work. Some monks will continue their prayers or engage in spiritual reading late into the night, seeking to draw closer to God in the stillness of the evening. The cycle of prayer, work, and reflection begins again the next morning as the monks rise to offer their thanks to God for another day. The rhythm of the monks' day on Mount Athos is one of simplicity, discipline, and spiritual focus. It is a life of constant devotion, where each moment is an opportunity to live in the presence of God. While the world outside is full of noise and distraction, the monks of Mount Athos remain steadfast in their commitment to silence, prayer, and humility. Through their daily lives, they show the world a different way of being, a way that is not defined by success, wealth, or worldly recognition, but by a deep and unwavering connection to the divine. Among the many unique features of life on Mount Athos, perhaps none is as central to the monastic experience as the rule of silence. This sacred silence is not simply the absence of noise, but a deliberate choice, a spiritual practice, one that reflects the monk's dedication to solitude, contemplation, and prayer. It is a silence that permeates every aspect of life, creating a sacred space for reflection, connection with God, and inward growth. For the hermits and monks of Mount Athos, silence is not a void, It is a rich, living practice that deepens their spiritual life. The rule of silence on Mount Athos is not imposed by a rigid law, but is understood as a form of asceticism, a voluntary renunciation of words and distractions in order to foster a deeper union with the divine. Silence allows the monks to remove the external noise of the world, making space for the inner stillness that is essential for prayer and spiritual clarity. It is a silence meant to draw them closer to God, to help them focus on the eternal, and to cultivate an awareness of His presence in every moment. For the monks of Mount Athos, this practice of silence is not merely a preference. It is a fundamental part of their spiritual identity. Silence is seen as a way to purify the soul, to detach from worldly concerns, and to nurture a life of prayer and contemplation. In a world that is increasingly noisy and filled with distractions, silence becomes a form of resistance, a refusal to be swept away by the rhythms of modern life. The monks are not simply retreating from society. They are deliberately creating an environment that is conducive to inner peace, where they can focus fully on the divine. The rule of silence manifests itself in several ways throughout the day. In the monasteries, silence is observed during the communal prayer services, where no one speaks except the priest or the designated chanter. The monks move through the rituals in complete silence, their prayers and chants filling the air with the sacred sound of devotion. In the refectories, where the monks eat, there is no conversation. Meals are taken in complete silence, with the focus entirely on the food and the act of eating, as an offering to God. Even during work, while the monks may occasionally exchange necessary words of instruction, their primary focus is on the task at hand, done in quiet reverence. For the hermits, living in solitude far from the monasteries, silence takes on an even deeper significance. In their isolated cells, perched on the mountain slopes, they embrace a life of complete silence. Their days are spent in prayer, work, and reading sacred texts, but they do so without the need for words. Their isolation from the world, both physically and socially, is an essential part of their spiritual discipline. Here, in the quiet of their cells, the hermits engage in the deepest form of silence, which is not just the absence of speech, but a kind of interior stillness that allows them to listen to the whispers of God. The practice of silence, however, is not always easy. For the hermits, it can be a constant challenge, as they learn to silence not only their tongues, but also their thoughts and desires. The act of speaking, or even thinking too much, is seen as a distraction from the divine presence that is sought in silence. The monks believe that it is through silence that they can experience the full weight of God's presence and grace. As such, silence is cultivated as a means of spiritual purification. Each word, each thought is seen as an obstacle that stands between them and God. The practice of silence, therefore, is a way of allowing the monks to clear away the distractions of the world and come closer to a pure, unmediated experience of the divine. The significance of silence in monastic life on Mount Athos also extends to the relationships between the monks. While the monks may live in communal settings, there is still an emphasis on avoiding unnecessary conversation. The monks are taught that speaking unnecessarily is a form of distraction, one that takes them away from their spiritual focus. Conversations, when they occur, are typically about spiritual matters. In the rare moments when the monks do engage with one another, their discussions revolve around God, their shared faith, and their shared experiences. These conversations, when they happen, are seen as spiritual exercises, chances to reflect on and deepen their relationship with God. But even here, the goal is always to maintain an atmosphere of silence, where the spoken word does not overshadow the deeper, silent connection that is fostered by the prayers and rituals of the day. Silence, however, is not a form of withdrawal or avoidance. It is not about disconnecting from the world or ignoring the needs of others. The monks of Mount Athos are, in many ways, deeply connected to the world, even though they have removed themselves from its distractions. Their silence is an active choice, one that allows them to be more attuned to the needs of the world around them, particularly the spiritual needs of others. Visitors and pilgrims to Mount Athos often come seeking guidance and comfort, and the monks, though silent, are always ready to offer spiritual counsel, though it may be given sparingly, in a few carefully chosen words. The silence is not a rejection of the world, but a means of ensuring that when they do speak, their words are meaningful, focused, and aligned with the divine purpose. Despite the overwhelming emphasis on silence, Mount Athos is far from a quiet place in the conventional sense. There are sounds on the mountain, sounds that carry deep spiritual significance. The chants and hymns of the monks echo through the air during the divine liturgy. The bells ring to mark the passing of time, and the rustling of the wind through the trees is a constant companion to the prayers of the monks. These sounds, though present, are part of a larger silence. It's a silence that allows the monks to perceive the sacred in all things. In a sense, the silence of Mount Athos is not an absence, but a presence that suffuses every aspect of life on the mountain, from the smallest prayer to the grandest liturgical celebration. The rule of silence on Mount Athos is not just a rule to be followed, it is a way of life, a pathway to deeper spiritual understanding. It is an invitation to step outside the noise of the world and enter into a place of peace and serenity, where the focus is not on external circumstances, but on the inner life of the soul. The monks and hermits of Mount Athos live this silence every day, allowing it to shape their lives and their relationship with God. In this silence, they are not alone. They are united with all the saints who have gone before them, all those who have sought God through prayer and contemplation. For the monks of Mount Athos, silence is not just a practice, it is a doorway to the divine. The monasteries of Mount Athos are not just religious centers. They are complex communities with their own hierarchies, traditions, and unique ways of life. These monasteries, each one steeped in centuries of history, are home to the bulk of the monks living on the mountain. While hermits and solitary monks often inhabit the more remote areas of Mount Athos, the monasteries are where the communal life takes place, where monks gather together in worship, work, and spiritual pursuit. Each monastery is like a small, self-contained world, with its own rules, customs, and leadership, but all are bound by the overarching ethos of Mount Athos, a commitment to prayer, silence, and spiritual growth. The number of monasteries on Mount Athos is usually fixed at 20, a number that has been maintained for centuries. These monasteries are the spiritual and administrative centers of the Holy Mountain, and each one is home to a community of monks who follow a strict monastic rule. The largest monasteries on Mount Athos house a sizable number of monks, often over 100, while the smaller monasteries may only house a handful of monks. Despite their differences in size, all of the monasteries are dedicated to the same goal: to live a life of complete devotion to God, free from the distractions and temptations of the world. One of the most important aspects of life in the monasteries is the hierarchy that governs the community. The head of each monastery is called the hegemonos or abbot, and he is responsible for the spiritual and practical well-being of the monks under his care. The hegemonos is chosen based on his spiritual wisdom, humility, and leadership ability. He is a father figure to the monks, offering guidance and counsel, both spiritual and practical. His role is one of great responsibility, as he oversees not only the monastic practices of the community, but also its daily operations, including the upkeep of the monastery. the management of the monastery's resources, and the overall health of the community. Under the hegumenos, there are other monks who hold titles based on their responsibilities. The Aegean is typically a monk who has been given a specific task, such as overseeing the monastery's garden, library, or finances. These roles are vital for the smooth running of the monastery. As the monks live a life of simplicity and self-sufficiency, there is also the clericus, a monk who is responsible for the liturgical functions of the monastery, ensuring that the prayers, services, and rituals are carried out with precision and devotion. The hierarchical structure of the monastery is not meant to create divisions, but rather to ensure that the life of the community is organized, efficient, and spiritually focused. The abbot and the other monks work together, each contributing to the communal life according to his gifts and talent. The monastery's success depends on cooperation, obedience, and humility. In many ways, the hierarchy of Mount Athos is a reflection of the broader spiritual ideals that underpin the monastic life, an emphasis on order, structure, and the pursuit of holiness through service to God and the community. While the hegumenos is the head of a monastery, the hierosynaxis, the Holy Synod, plays a significant role in the overall governance of Mount Athos as a whole. This council is made up of representatives from each of the 20 monasteries, and it is responsible for making decisions that affect the Holy Mountain as a whole. The Synod meets regularly to discuss matters of governance, such as the approval of new monks, the management of the land, and the preservation of the spiritual integrity of Mount Athos. The decisions made by the hierosynaxis are carried out by the individual monasteries, ensuring that there is harmony and unity throughout the Holy Mountain. One of the key features of the monasteries on Mount Athos is their self-sufficiency. Each monastery is responsible for providing for its own needs, both material and spiritual. The monks work diligently to ensure that they can support themselves, cultivating gardens, raising livestock, brewing wine, and crafting religious items such as incense and icons. The monasteries are built to withstand the passage of time, with their stone walls, wooden beams, and Byzantine-style architecture. The buildings themselves are works of art, each one a reflection of the spiritual and cultural heritage of the monks who built them. Inside the monasteries, the layout is designed to support the communal life of the monks. The central church, or catholicon, is the focal point of the monastery. This is where the monks gather for daily prayers and liturgies. The church is often decorated with intricate frescoes, icons, and mosaics that depict scenes from the Bible and the lives of the saints. The beauty of the church is not just for aesthetic enjoyment. It is a reflection of the sacredness of the space where the monks come together to offer their prayers and connect with the divine. In addition to the church, each monastery has its own refectory or dining hall where the monks gather for their simple meals. The refectory is often a place of quiet reflection where the monks eat in silence, focusing on their food as a gift from God. The meals are simple but nourishing, reflecting the monks' commitment to asceticism and moderation. The monks also gather in the refectory for fellowship, though the conversations are few and typically focused on spiritual matters. Socialization is not the focus of the monastic life, and the monks are careful to avoid distractions that might take them away from their spiritual work. The monks' quarters are simple rooms, known as cells, which are typically sparsely furnished with only the most essential items: a bed, a small altar, and a few personal belongings. In the silence of their cells, the monks continue their prayers, read scripture, and meditate. The cell is a place of solitude and reflection, where the monk can focus entirely on his spiritual life. The monks take care to keep their cells clean and orderly, as a reflection of the inner order they seek in their hearts. Despite the austere nature of life in the monasteries, the monks of Mount Athos experience a deep sense of community and shared purpose. While their lives are centered around prayer and work, the relationships they form with one another are central to their spiritual journey. The monks support each other, both spiritually and practically, offering encouragement, guidance, and prayer. The hierarchical structure of the monastery helps ensure that each monk is cared for, that their needs are met, and that they are able to focus on their spiritual work. For the monks of Mount Athos, the monastery is not just a place to live. It is a sacred space where they can draw near to God, a place of protection from the distractions of the outside world. The hierarchy within the monasteries ensures that the monastic community remains focused on its mission to live a life of prayer, silence, and devotion. The spiritual journey of each monk is supported by the structure and order of the monastery, where each monk plays a vital role in the life of the community. In the simplicity of their lives and the sacred space they inhabit, the monks of Mount Athos embody a way of life that remains steadfast, despite the changing world around them. On Mount Athos, asceticism is not just a choice. It is the very foundation of monastic life. Asceticism, the practice of self-discipline and self-denial for spiritual growth, is woven into every aspect of the monk's daily routine. It is a commitment to living a life that is free from worldly attachments, embracing simplicity, humility, and a singular focus on God. For the monks and hermits of Mount Athos, asceticism is the pathway to holiness, a means of purifying soul and drawing closer to the divine. It is through asceticism that they hope to rid themselves of the distractions that pull them away from God and develop a deeper connection to the spiritual realm. The ascetic life on Mount Athos is demanding. It requires not just physical endurance, but mental and spiritual fortitude. For the monks, every aspect of life, whether it be food, sleep, work, or prayer, becomes an opportunity for spiritual growth and self-control. The monks voluntarily embrace hardship and discomfort, not as a form of punishment, but as a way to strip away the attachments and desires that keep them from fully focusing on God. The goal of asceticism is not to punish the body, but to purify it, to rid it of its excessive desires, and to bring it into alignment with the will of God. One of the most well-known forms of asceticism on Mount Athos is fasting. Fasting is not simply abstaining from food for the sake of hunger or deprivation. It is a way of humbling oneself, of renouncing the physical pleasures that often dominate daily life. Fasting helps the monks develop self-discipline and teaches them to focus on the spiritual rather than the material. The monks observe strict fasting periods throughout the year, particularly during Lent and other periods of the liturgical calendar. During these times, they refrain from eating certain foods such as meat, dairy, and sometimes even fish, and they consume fewer meals each day. The goal of fasting is to turn the monk's attention inward, away from the satisfaction of bodily desires, and toward the fulfillment of spiritual hunger. Fasting on Mount Athos is not just about abstaining from food, however. It is also about cultivating a spirit of humility and self-control. The monks do not fast for the sake of weight loss or health benefits, but as a way of purifying their hearts and minds. Fasting is seen as an opportunity to confront the desires of the body and to focus on the needs of the soul. It is a spiritual exercise, a way to remind the monks that they are not defined by their physical appetites, but by their relationship with God. In addition to fasting, the monks practice a form of asceticism known as nepsis, a discipline of watchfulness and self-control over one's thoughts and emotions. Nepsis is the spiritual practice of guarding the heart and mind, preventing distractions and negative thoughts from taking root. The monks seek to cultivate an awareness of their inner state, being mindful of their thoughts, feelings, and reactions throughout the day. They are trained to be vigilant, to avoid getting caught up in sinful or distracting thoughts, and to focus instead on prayer and contemplation. Nepsis is a way of constantly aligning one's thoughts and desires with God's will, keeping the mind and heart focused on the divine, even amid the mundane tasks of daily life. For the hermits who live in the more remote areas of Mount Athos, the practice of asceticism can be even more extreme. These monks live alone, in small, isolated cells, and they often engage in intense forms of fasting, prayer, and self-denial. Their lives are dedicated to the search for spiritual enlightenment, and they embrace physical discomfort as a way to strip away their dependence on earthly things. The hermits often spend hours in prayer, chanting, and meditation, seeking to quiet their minds and draw closer to God. They may live in the most basic of conditions, sometimes without electricity, running water, or even heat, choosing to embrace the harshness of the mountain as a way to purify their hearts. While the physical hardships of asceticism are evident, the spiritual benefits are considered far greater. The monks believe that by embracing asceticism they are able to achieve spiritual freedom, a freedom from the distractions and attachments that bind them to the material world. Asceticism for the monks of Mount Athos is not about escaping from life, but about transcending its limitations. It is about living a life that is wholly dedicated to God, where every thought, every action, and every moment is a reflection of divine purpose. One of the most challenging aspects of the ascetic life on Mount Athos is the vow of poverty. The monks take a vow to live without personal wealth or possessions, relying instead on the resources provided by their monasteries. They wear simple robes, live in humble quarters, and renounce any claim to material goods. This vow is not just a rejection of wealth, but a rejection of the idea that material possessions can provide true happiness or fulfillment. For the monks, true happiness comes from communion with God, not from accumulating wealth or comfort. The vow of poverty is a way to remind them that they are pilgrims in this world, passing through temporarily, and that their true home is with God. The vow of poverty also extends to their relationships with others. The monks live in community, but the focus of that community is on shared spiritual growth, not on social or familial bonds. While the monks have a deep sense of brotherhood, they are not attached to one another in the way that family members or friends might be. Instead, their relationships are grounded in a shared commitment to the monastic life and a common devotion to God. In this way, asceticism also involves a detachment from emotional attachments, allowing the monks to live in a state of spiritual freedom, open to the love and grace of God without the distractions of personal desires or relationships. Despite the intense nature of asceticism on Mount Athos, the monks view it as a path to spiritual joy. The ascetic practices, fasting, silence, poverty, and prayer are not seen as burdens to bear, but as opportunities for growth. In the ascetic life, the monks find a deeper sense of peace, a serenity that comes from renouncing the temporal for the eternal. It is in this simplicity, in this focused devotion, that they believe they can come closest to God. The monastic life, as lived on Mount Athos, is a life of total surrender, a surrender of self to the divine, of ego to humility, and of the body's desires to the spirit's hunger for God. The goal of asceticism on Mount Athos is not perfection, but transformation. The monks do not seek to punish themselves, but to purify themselves, to shed the layers of sin, desire, and attachment that cloud their hearts and minds. Asceticism is the means by which they hope to reach the ultimate goal of the monastic life, to become one with God, to see him face to face, and to experience the fullness of his love. In this way, asceticism on Mount Athos is not just a set of practices, but a spiritual journey, a journey that continues from the first prayer of the day until the last breath of life. Though Mount Athos is primarily a sanctuary for the monks and hermits who call it home, the mountain is also a place of pilgrimage for those who seek spiritual renewal, guidance, or simply a glimpse into a life far removed from the hustle and bustle of the modern world. Pilgrims travel from all corners of the globe to visit the holy mountain, drawn by its profound sense of peace, its ancient spiritual traditions, and its reputation as a center of Orthodox Christianity. While the monks' lives are defined by silence and solitude, the arrival of pilgrims introduces a unique form of interaction, one that allows the monks to offer spiritual counsel and share the quiet wisdom they have cultivated over years of monastic life. The journey to Mount Athos is not an easy one. Pilgrims must first obtain a special permit, called a daimoniterium, to visit the mountain, as access is strictly regulated. Only men are allowed on the mountain. In keeping with the long-standing tradition of Mount Athos as a male-only space, women are not permitted to visit the mountain, a rule rooted in both religious and cultural traditions. The process of receiving the permit itself is a spiritual rite of passage, as it requires the pilgrim to seek permission from the Athonite authorities and demonstrate their genuine desire to enter this sacred space. Once a pilgrim receives the daimoniterium, the journey begins with a boat ride from the mainland of Greece to one of the ports on Mount Athos. The journey across the Aegean Sea is often described as a liminal experience, an entry into a world apart. The boat ride is the first step toward crossing from the noise of the modern world into the profound silence of the holy mountain. The sea, which surrounds Mount Athos on three sides, serves as a natural boundary between the everyday world and the sanctity of the mountain. As pilgrims approach the shores of the holy mountain, they can sense the transition, both physical and spiritual, as they move closer to their destination. Upon arrival, pilgrims often feel a deep sense of reverence as they set foot on the sacred ground of Mount Athos. They are greeted by monks who welcome them with the same warmth and humility that define the monastic life. Though the monks live in seclusion, their hospitality is renowned. The monks' primary mission is not to engage in worldly affairs, but to help pilgrims on their spiritual journeys. Many pilgrims arrive seeking a deeper connection with God, hoping to find peace and clarity in the midst of their lives' struggles and challenges. In this sense, Mount Athos is both a destination and a transformative experience, offering pilgrims a chance to recalibrate their spiritual compass and immerse themselves in a sacred atmosphere. Once on the mountain, pilgrims are encouraged to partake in the daily routines of the monks. They are invited to join in the communal prayers and services, which are the heart of monastic life. Many pilgrims find that participating in the liturgies and services, even in silence, allows them to experience a profound sense of spiritual communion. The liturgy, with its chanting and incense, fills the air with a palpable sense of holiness. Pilgrims often report feeling deeply moved by the ancient rhythm of the prayers, the sense of timelessness that envelops them as they join in the sacred rituals that have been practiced for centuries. Beyond the liturgies, pilgrims are also invited to spend time in silence and solitude, reflecting on their own spiritual journeys. Mount Athos is a place where silence is not simply a lack of sound, but a doorway to deeper understanding and connection. In the stillness of the mountain, pilgrims often find that they are able to hear their own hearts more clearly, to strip away the noise of their everyday lives, and to focus on their relationship with God. The monks, too, encourage this solitude, as it allows pilgrims to experience something of the monastic way of life, living in communion with God without the distractions of modernity. The monks on Mount Athos are not just spiritual guides, they are also living witnesses to a different way of life. The way they live, marked by humility, simplicity, and prayer, serves as a living example for pilgrims. The monks do not preach with words, but with their actions. The example of their lives often speaks louder than anything they could say. Pilgrims are struck by the depth of the monks' commitment to God and the quiet joy they find in the simplicity of their daily routines. For many, a visit to Mount Athos is not just an opportunity to receive advice or counsel, but a chance to witness a living example of spiritual dedication that is both humbling and inspiring. The monks, in turn, often offer counsel to pilgrims, but it is always done with humility and discretion. The monks understand that the pilgrimage to Mount Athos is a personal journey, and they respect the individual spiritual path of each visitor. For many pilgrims, the most meaningful exchanges with the monks come in the form of quiet conversations, where the monks offer guidance, prayers, or simply a listening ear. These conversations are rarely long or filled with many words. The monks' counsel tends to be simple and direct, grounded in their lived experience and their deep understanding of the spiritual life. They often speak in terms of practical advice, encouraging pilgrims to focus on prayer, to live simply, and to embrace humility. For some pilgrims, the pilgrimage to Mount Athos becomes a transformative experience. Many leave the mountain feeling renewed, their spiritual lives deepened by the quiet and contemplative atmosphere of the holy mountain. They return to the world, but they often carry a piece of Mount Athos with them, whether in the form of a deeper connection with God, a newfound sense of peace, or simply the memory of having experienced something rare and sacred. In addition to the individual pilgrims, Mount Athos also hosts groups on pilgrimages, where entire communities of faithful Christians arrive to experience the spiritual richness of the mountain. These groups typically spend several days on the mountain, visiting different monasteries, praying in the churches, and walking the rugged paths that lead through the forests and hills of the holy mountain. The communal aspect of these pilgrimages adds a layer of fellowship and shared devotion, allowing pilgrims to connect not just with the monks but with one another, all united by their faith. While the number of pilgrims who can visit Mount Athos is strictly regulated, the mountain remains an important spiritual destination for thousands each year. The visit is, for many, a profound spiritual experience, an opportunity to step away from the distractions of modern life and enter into a world that is focused entirely on God. The monks of Mount Athos are not just caretakers of the mountain, they are spiritual guides for all who come to seek them out, offering a witness to a life lived in devotion and humility, and providing a place of peace and prayer for those who need it most. The story of Mount Athos is not just one of monks, prayer, and silence. It is the story of an enduring way of life that has managed to survive centuries of change. Over the years, Mount Athos has withstood political turmoil, social upheaval, and the pressures of modernization, yet it remains steadfast in its mission to be a place of prayer, asceticism, and spiritual renewal. In a world that often seems to be moving faster and faster, the monks of Mount Athos offer an alternative, a living testament to the power of silence, simplicity, and devotion. The fact that Mount Athos has persisted for over 1,000 years is a testament to its deep spiritual roots. While the world outside the mountain has changed beyond recognition, the monastic communities on Mount Athos have remained largely unchanged, holding fast to ancient traditions that go back to the early Christian period. The rhythms of prayer, fasting, and work that define monastic life on the mountain have been passed down through generations, preserving a spiritual continuity that is rare in our fast-moving world. This continuity is in many ways the heart of Mount Athos's legacy. The monastic communities on the mountain are not just living in the past, they are living the same spiritual practices that their forebears lived, maintaining a tradition that is rooted in a timeless understanding of the spiritual life. The monks of Mount Athos see themselves not as individuals, but as part of a long chain of monks who have lived on this mountain, who have prayed in these same chapels, and who have followed the same spiritual disciplines. The continuity of their lives is not just a personal legacy, it is a shared legacy, one that binds the monks of today with those who came before them, and with those who will follow. One of the most remarkable aspects of Mount Athos's legacy is its ability to attract people to its timeless message. While the world has changed around it, Mount Athos remains a beacon of spiritual light for people from all walks of life. From all corners of the globe, pilgrims continue to travel to the holy mountain, seeking peace, spiritual guidance, or simply a respite from the noise and chaos of the modern world. Some come seeking answers to deep spiritual questions, while others come to experience a sense of silence and tranquility that is increasingly hard to find in today's world. The monks of Mount Athos continue to live in relative seclusion, but their influence stretches far beyond the boundaries of the holy mountain. Through their writings, teachings, and the example of their lives, they offer a vision of a life lived fully in devotion to God. Their spiritual commitment is a powerful reminder that there is more to life than the pursuit of material wealth or worldly success. In a society that often prioritizes achievement, power, and individualism, the monks of Mount Athos offer an alternative, a life focused on humility, prayer, and the search for spiritual depth. In this sense, Mount Athos is not just a geographical location, it is a symbol of something larger. It represents the possibility of a life lived in deep connection with the divine, a life that is not defined by external success, but by an internal pursuit of holiness. The monks of Mount Athos embody this ideal, living each day with a sense of devotion that transcends the noise of the world. For them, the ultimate goal is not personal achievement, but a union with God, a union that is found in the silence of the mountain, in the simplicity of daily life, and in the deep interiority of prayer. Yet, Mount Athos's legacy is also tied to its extraordinary preservation of Orthodox Christian traditions. It is home to a rich artistic and theological heritage, much of which remains an active part of the spiritual life on the mountain today. The icons, frescoes, and religious artifacts found in the monasteries are not mere relics of the past, they are living expressions of faith. The monks continue to create and venerate these sacred works of art, using them not only as devotional tools but as a means of drawing closer to God. The icons are windows into the divine, each one a piece of spiritual wisdom passed down through the ages. The preservation of ancient Christian texts and traditions is another vital aspect of Mount Athos's legacy. The monasteries house libraries filled with manuscripts, many of which are centuries old. These texts contain the theological writings of early Christian fathers, the spiritual insights of the Desert Fathers, and the liturgical prayers that have shaped the Orthodox Church for over 1,000 years. These libraries are treasures, not only because of their age and rarity, but because they contain the wisdom of a spiritual tradition that has shaped generations of Christians. The monks of Mount Athos continue to study these texts, to write and copy new manuscripts, ensuring that the intellectual and spiritual heritage of the mountain is passed on to future generations. One of the most enduring legacies of Mount Athos is its ability to adapt while remaining true to its core mission. Despite its deep roots in tradition, Mount Athos is not completely immune to the forces of modernity. Though the monks still live in relative isolation, they recognize the importance of engaging with the world outside their walls, particularly in areas such as the preservation of the mountain itself. In recent years, there have been efforts to protect Mount Athos's unique environment from the threats of modern development, ensuring that the natural beauty of the mountain, its forests, gardens, and cliffs remains untouched for future generations. The monks have also worked to expand their outreach, offering spiritual guidance to pilgrims and maintaining connections with the Orthodox Christian world. Even as they live their lives in solitude, Mount Athos remains a symbol of spiritual resilience, a place where ancient traditions are preserved in the face of a rapidly changing world. The monks who live on the holy mountain continue to offer a vision of a life lived fully in devotion to God, unencumbered by the distractions of modern life. Their ascetic practices, their commitment to silence and prayer, and their deep sense of humility are a reminder that there is another way to live, one that prioritizes the soul over the body, prayer over possessions, and spiritual depth over worldly success. As the world continues to evolve, Mount Athos remains a living testament to the timelessness of the human desire to connect with the divine. It is a place where the ancient and the contemporary meet, where the past and the future come together in the shared pursuit of holiness. The monks of Mount Athos offer us all an invitation to consider a different path, a path that leads away from the noise of the world and into the silence where true peace is found. Through their example, they remind us that the search for meaning, for connection with God, is as urgent and relevant today as it ever was, and that the sacred mountain continues to stand as a beacon for all who seek it. Every chapter leaves a trace, and those traces twist into the next story, sharper, stranger, and pulling us deeper than before. The past doesn't rest, and neither will we. This is frozen murmurs of Scythian tombs, life beneath the permafrost. In the vast, wind-swept expanse of the Eurasian steppe, beneath a sky so wide it can swallow you whole, there are tombs that hold the whispers of an ancient people, long gone. These tombs, scattered across the frosty reaches of modern-day Ukraine, southern Russia, and Kazakhstan, are the final resting places of the Scythians, an enigmatic group of horse-riding warriors who once ruled the steppes, shaping the history of Central Asia and beyond. The Scythians left no written language, but their tombs, buried beneath layers of permafrost, speak volumes about their lives, their beliefs, and their rich culture. The Scythians were not just nomads, they were a force of nature, their influence stretching from the shores of the Black Sea to the edges of China. They were fierce warriors, skilled archers, and masters of horseback riding. For centuries, they dominated the steppe, leaving behind a legacy that is still shrouded in mystery. The remains of their lives, trinkets, weapons, ornate jewelry, and even the bodies of their leaders are preserved in the tombs they built to honor their dead. These tombs, often referred to as kurgans, are burial mounds that rise like silent sentinels across the landscape. Some are simple, while others are grand, reflecting the power and status of those interred within. The tombs of the Scythians are far more than mere burial sites. They are windows into a lost world, a glimpse into the daily lives of a people who existed long before the rise of modern civilizations. For centuries, these tombs lay undisturbed beneath the frozen earth, hidden from the prying eyes of history. But in the 19th and 20th centuries, as archaeologists began to excavate these burial mounds, they uncovered treasures beyond imagination. Gold jewelry, intricate bronze weapons, and even the preserved remains of the Scythians themselves, all buried with their rulers and warriors, painted a picture of a people who, despite their ancient origins, were extraordinarily sophisticated. What makes these tombs even more remarkable is the way in which the cold, unforgiving climate of the steppes has preserved them. The permafrost, that eternal layer of frozen earth that blankets much of the region, has acted as a natural preservative, keeping the treasures of the Scythians almost perfectly intact for over 2,000 years. In some cases, the tombs have yielded not only material artifacts but also organic remains, such as the remains of horses, weapons, and even the bodies of the Scythians themselves, preserved in the frigid depths of the earth. It is in these preserved tombs that the murmurs of the Scythians can still be heard, frozen in time, waiting to tell their story. As we venture deeper into the world of Scythian tombs, we are confronted with a picture of life and death that is at once foreign and familiar. The Scythians were not just warriors, they were also deeply spiritual people, with beliefs that centered around the afterlife. For them, the tombs were not merely places of burial, they were gateways to another world, a world where the dead could continue their lives in a new form. The Scythians believed that the soul of a warrior lived on after death, and that the tombs were a place where they could be honored and prepared for their journey into the afterlife. The kurgans, the burial mounds, were built with great care and ceremony, often taking years to construct inside. The dead were laid to rest with their most prized possessions, weapons, gold jewelry, food, and sometimes even their horses. It was believed that these items would accompany the deceased on their journey to the afterlife, helping them in the next world as they had in this one. The tombs of the Scythian rulers were particularly lavish, reflecting the high status of those buried within. In these tombs, the dead were not simply buried, they were celebrated, honored, and provided for, as though they were still living. One of the most remarkable aspects of the Scythian tombs is the discovery of preserved bodies, many of which are still remarkably intact despite their age. The cold, dry conditions of the permafrost have allowed these bodies to be preserved in a way that is almost unheard of in other parts of the world. When these tombs were first opened by archaeologists, they were met with the startling sight of Scythian warriors lying in state, their bodies frozen in time. Some of these tombs contained entire families, buried together with their possessions, while others were the final resting places of individual rulers or elite warriors. In the tombs, the bodies were often carefully arranged, sometimes sitting upright, with their hands placed in symbolic positions. Horses, which were essential to the Scythians' way of life, were often buried alongside their masters, providing them with the means to travel to the afterlife. Some tombs contained elaborate burial rituals with sacrifices made to honor the deceased and ensure their journey to the next world. In one famous discovery, archaeologists unearthed a tomb that contained not only the body of a Scythian warrior, but also that of a woman believed to have been his wife or consort, buried alongside him. This practice of including family members and servants in royal burials suggests a complex understanding of the afterlife, one which the connections between the living and the dead were maintained. As we step back from the frozen tombs of the Scythians, we begin to appreciate the enormity of their civilization, one that, despite its warlike nature, was deeply connected to the land and its beliefs. Their tombs tell us much about their view of death and the afterlife, but they also reveal a culture that valued art, craftsmanship, and the intricacies of daily life. The gold jewelry, decorated weapons, and intricately woven textiles found in these tombs offer us a glimpse into the artistic sensibilities of the Scythians. They were a people who, despite their fierce reputation as warriors, also appreciated beauty and craftsmanship. These items were not just functional, they were symbolic, meant to convey the status and power of the individuals buried with them. As we begin to understand the significance of these tombs, we realize that the frozen murmurs of the Scythians speak to us not just of war and conquest, but also of a complex, layered society that valued art, spirituality, and community. These tombs are not just the resting places of warriors. They are a testament to a people who believed that death was not an end, but a transition to a new, eternal life. The echoes of the Scythians remain with us, frozen in time, their stories waiting to be uncovered, their whispers waiting to be heard once more. The kurgans of the Scythians are more than mere burial mounds. They are the silent monuments to a people who ruled the vast Eurasian steppe for centuries. These burial mounds scattered across the region form an integral part of the cultural and spiritual landscape of the Scythians. To understand the importance of the kurgans is to understand the deep spiritual connection the Scythians had with the land. These tombs were not just places to bury the dead, they were the physical manifestation of the Scythian belief in the afterlife, a sacred space where the boundary between the living and the dead was thin and permeable. The kurgans were constructed with great care and precision, often placed on prominent hills or high ground, where they could be beamed from miles around. This was not just a matter of practical convenience, but a reflection of the Scythian belief that their dead, especially the warriors and rulers, were honored in a manner befitting their status. These mounds were designed to reflect the cosmic order rising from the earth, like an earthly representation of the heavens above. The Scythians believed that the spirits of the dead continued to watch over the living, and that the tombs were sacred spaces that allowed these spirits to remain close to their people. The construction of the kurgans was no simple task. They were often massive, some reaching heights of over 30 feet, and could span up to 100 feet in diameter. The process of building these tombs required significant labor, and they were typically constructed by the family or community of the deceased. It was not just the physical act of burying the dead that was important, but the communal effort to honor the deceased and ensure that their transition into the afterlife was as smooth as possible. Inside the kurgans, the dead were laid to rest with a variety of grave goods, objects that reflected their status in life and were believed to be essential for their journey into the next world. Weapons, jewelry, and tools were commonly placed with the body, as well as food and drink to sustain the deceased on their journey. In the case of high-ranking individuals, particularly warriors and rulers, the burial was even more elaborate. The bodies were sometimes accompanied by elaborate gold ornaments, finely crafted weapons, and intricately decorated clothing. Horses, which were central to the Scythians' nomadic lifestyle, were often sacrificed and buried alongside their masters. This practice suggested that the Scythians believed their dead would continue to need the same resources and companions in the afterlife that they had enjoyed during their lifetime. The tombs of the Scythian rulers were particularly lavish. The tomb of the famous Scythian king, Scoilus, found near the Black Sea, is a prime example of the grandness of these burials. His tomb, along with those of other high-status individuals, was marked by large stone or wooden structures, often with intricate carvings and depictions of the deceased's life and achievements. The grave goods found within these tombs revealed a wealth of artistic and cultural sophistication. Gold jewelry, including necklaces, bracelets, and rings, was commonplace. Weapons such as daggers, swords, and arrowheads were often finely decorated with gold or bronze. These items were not merely ornamental, they were functional, tools to aid the deceased in their afterlife, ensuring they could continue their roles as warriors and leaders beyond death. One of the most remarkable finds in the kurgans is the discovery of the famous Scythian gold. Artisans of the Scythian culture were highly skilled, and their goldsmithing techniques were advanced for their time. They created intricate pieces of jewelry, ceremonial objects, and burial goods that were unparalleled in beauty and craftsmanship. The gold burial masks, often found in the tombs of the Scythian nobility, are some of the most iconic pieces of Scythian art. These masks, depicting fierce expressions, were likely intended to protect the deceased in the afterlife, ensuring that they were safe from evil spirits. These tombs also offer insights into the complex social structure of the Scythians. While the elite were buried with lavish goods and grand ceremonies, the burials of ordinary Scythians were simpler, though still marked by a sense of reverence. Commoners were often buried with weapons, pottery, and jewelry, but without the extravagance that characterized the burials of the ruling class. Even in death, the Scythians adhered to a strict hierarchy, where social status determined not just the way one lived, but how one was remembered and honored after death. One of the most intriguing aspects of Scythian burial practices is the relationship between the dead and the living. The tombs were not just the final resting places of the deceased. They were spiritual hubs where the living could continue to honor their ancestors and seek guidance from them. The Scythians believed the dead had the power to influence the living, and it was essential for the community to maintain a connection with their ancestors through offerings, rituals, and the care of their tomb. The burial mounds, therefore, were not just physical markers of death. They were places where the boundaries between life and death blurred, where the spirits of the deceased continued to watch over the living. These burial practices also reflect the deep connection the Scythians had with nature and the land. The Scythians were a nomadic people, relying on their horses and the open steppe for survival. They were deeply attuned to the natural world, and their spiritual beliefs were tied to the cycles of nature. The kurgans were often placed in locations that had symbolic significance, on the highest points of the landscape, where they could be seen from great distances as a sign of the enduring presence of the deceased. The act of burial itself was seen as part of a larger cosmic cycle, in which the living and the dead were constantly in dialogue, bound together by a shared connection to the land. The kurgans, in this sense, were not just tombs. They were sacred spaces that connected the past, present, and future. They were the focal point of Scythian spirituality, a place where the dead continued to play a role in the lives of the living. And though many of these tombs have long since been forgotten, buried beneath centuries of soil, the whispers of the Scythians continue to echo through time, carried by the frozen winds of the steppe. As we stand before these ancient mounds, we are reminded not only of the Scythians' mastery of the land, but of their deep spiritual understanding which transcended the limitations of time and death. These tombs, like the people who built them, are enduring symbols of a culture that lived fully in the world, while simultaneously reaching for something beyond it. The frozen murmurs of the Scythians may be faint, but they are still present, etched into the bones of the earth, waiting to speak to those who will listen. Buried beneath the frozen earth of the Eurasian steppe, the kurgans not only housed the bones of mighty kings and warriors, but also the remnants of a world that, for all its grandeur, has mostly vanished from history. Within these ancient mounds, the buried kings of the Scythians still reign, silent figures whose tombs reveal an astonishing level of wealth and power. But it is not just the kings themselves who are fascinating. The lives of their retainers, their servants, their warriors, and their horses offer a different, equally compelling glimpse into the world of the Scythians. The Scythian kings, or rex as some scholars have called them, were more than just political rulers. They were revered figures, almost divine in their stature. In life they commanded armies, oversaw the wealth of the tribes, and maintained complex trade relationships across vast distances, stretching from the Black Sea to the edges of China. But in death, they were also believed to transcend their earthly existence, becoming guardians of their people who would watch over them from beyond the grave. One of the most remarkable aspects of Scythian royal burials is the way in which these kings were interred with a host of retainers and servants. In many kurgans, the bodies of servants, soldiers, and sometimes even family members were found alongside the deceased king. These individuals, often sacrificed to accompany the ruler into the afterlife, were buried with the same respect and reverence as their masters. Their presence in the tomb speaks to the Scythian understanding of the afterlife as a continuation of life on earth, where the king and his most trusted followers would serve their roles in the spiritual realm as they did in life. The practice of accompanying the king with his retainers was not a simple act of sacrifice. It was a symbolic gesture that mirrored the hierarchy of life. The king was not seen as merely an individual, but as the center of a web of relationships. His warriors, his servants, and his family all played roles in the cosmic order to ensure the smooth transition into the afterlife. These individuals were buried with their king, ensuring that he would have everything he needed for the next phase of existence. In some cases, entire groups of retainers were buried together, as though they would continue their duties in the next world, serving their king in death as they did in life. One of the most famous examples of this practice is the tomb of the Scythian king, identified as King of the Golden Mound or the Kurgan of the Royal Scythians. Found near the Black Sea, the tomb contained not only the king, but also a number of other bodies, servants, warriors, and possibly his wives who were sacrificed to accompany him on his journey to the afterlife. The graves were often arranged in such a way that the body of the king was placed in the center, surrounded by the remains of those who would continue to serve him. This arrangement speaks to the deep hierarchical structure of Scythian society, where even in death, social roles and relationships were maintained. Alongside the remains of these individuals, the tombs of the Scythian kings often contained intricate burial goods. These items were not just for the king's enjoyment in the afterlife, but were considered essential for his journey. The wealth found within these tombs, golden ornaments, ceremonial weapons, elaborate garments, and horse gear, suggest that the Scythians saw the afterlife as a place where the king would continue to wield power, surrounded by the same opulence and authority he had enjoyed in life. Horses, the lifeblood of the Scythian nomadic existence, were often buried alongside the king, as it was believed that the king would need them to travel through the afterlife. The Scythians had a deep spiritual belief that death was not an end, but a transition. The burial rituals, the offerings, and the sacrifices were all intended to ensure that the king would have everything he needed in the afterlife. It was a reflection of the belief that life on earth and life after death were part of an unbroken continuum. The tombs, then, were not just final resting places, but cosmic gateways that ensured that the king could continue his rule. Now in the spiritual realm, the warriors buried with the kings in these kurgans also offer a glimpse into the military prowess of the Scythians. These men were the elite of their society, the very tip of the spear, and their weapons such as bronze swords, daggers, and spears are often found alongside their bodies. These warriors were more than just retainers. They were integral to the functioning of Scythian society. The fact that many of them were buried with their horses underscores their role as mounted archers and the military elite. For the Scythians, the warrior class was not only an essential part of society, but also a key to maintaining the balance between life and death. Among the buried retainers, however, there are also unexpected findings. In some tombs, the bodies of women were found alongside the king and his warriors. These women, possibly the king's consorts or noble women, were often buried with elaborate jewelry and fine clothing, indicating their high status within the Scythian elite. In one particularly famous discovery, a woman was found buried with the king, her body adorned with gold, and accompanied by intricate items, suggesting that she held significant power or status. The exact roles of women in Scythian society remain somewhat ambiguous, but the presence of women in royal tombs suggests that they held a place of reverence, possibly even a spiritual role in accompanying the king to the afterlife. The Scythians' treatment of death and the afterlife was rooted in a belief system that was as complex as their culture, while war and conquest were central to Scythian life. Their spirituality was equally important. The elaborate burial practices, the lavish grave goods, and the sacrificial rituals reflect a deep commitment to ensuring that the deceased, whether king, warrior, or servant, would be properly prepared for the next world. These tombs, with their frozen remains and ancient artifacts, offer a glimpse into a civilization that valued not only the triumphs of life, but the continuity of life after death. As we uncover more of the Scythian tombs and their secrets, we realize that the story of these people is more than just a tale of warrior kings and their conquests. It is a story of a culture that deeply believed in the sanctity of life and death, and in the power of the afterlife to shape the world of the living. The Scythian tombs, with their frozen murmurs, continue to tell this story, offering us a window into a world long gone, but still alive in the memory of the land. For the Scythians, the horse was not just a means of transportation, it was a central figure in their daily life, their spirituality, and their understanding of the afterlife. These nomadic people, whose lives were shaped by the open steppe and the need for mobility, regarded the horse as both a practical necessity and a sacred companion. In the world of the Scythians, the horse was more than a tool for war. It was a living symbol of power, freedom, and connection to the divine. And when the Scythian kings and warriors passed into death, their horses were there with them, guiding them into the afterlife. The burial of horses with their masters is one of the most striking features of Scythian tombs. These horses, often sacrificed and placed alongside their masters, were believed to serve an essential function in the afterlife, allowing the deceased to continue their travels and their warrior duties in the next world. The Scythians were expert horsemen, known for their speed, agility, and precision as mounted archers. The horse was not just an animal, it was a partner, a reflection of the warrior's own prowess. And so, it is no surprise that the Scythians believed that their horses would play a vital role in their journey beyond the grave. In some of the largest and most elaborate kurgans, the bodies of horses have been found arranged in such a way as to indicate the importance of their relationship with the dead. In one famous discovery, a large burial mound contained not only the body of a Scythian king, but also the remains of dozens of horses buried alongside their master. These horses, some of which were intricately adorned with gold and bronze fittings, were carefully placed in the tomb, their bodies arranged as though they were ready to gallop into the afterlife with their rider. The horses buried with the Scythian elite were often fitted with elaborate harnesses, decorated with gold and precious metals. These adornments served both as practical gear for the horse and as a symbolic representation of the king's wealth and power. The intricate craftsmanship of these items reveals just how important the horse was to the Scythians, not just as a tool of war, but as a key to their spiritual identity. The use of gold, silver, and other precious materials in the burial rituals suggests that the horse was a creature of divine significance, one that carried its master not only through life's battles, but through the transition to the next realm. In addition to the material offerings buried with the horses, there is evidence to suggest that the Scythians also viewed the horses themselves as spiritual beings. Some tombs contained representations of horses in the form of sculptures or painted images, suggesting that the horse had a sacred role in Scythian belief systems. These representations were often found in the tombs of the elite, where they were placed to accompany the deceased on their journey. The fact that the horses were sometimes adorned with ornamental decorations, such as sculpted heads, richly embroidered saddles, or finely crafted bridle pieces, shows that the Scythians viewed these animals as more than mere beasts of burden. The horses buried with the dead were not the only animals to accompany the deceased. In some cases, there were also offerings of dogs, birds, and other creatures. These animals, like the horses, were believed to serve the deceased in the afterlife, either as companions or as protectors. The Scythians, in their deep connection to the natural worlds, saw the animals of the steppe as spiritual partners, creatures whose roles were not confined to this world, but extended into the realm of the dead. The bond between Scythian kings and their horses can also be seen in the design of the tombs themselves. Many of the kurgans contained intricate stone and wooden structures that resembled the kinds of dwellings and stables the Scythians would have used in life. These structures were not just tombs. They were representations of the Scythian world, constructed to make the dead feel at home in the afterlife. The presence of horses within these tombs was a way of ensuring that the king's journey into the next world was as complete as possible, with all the elements of his life, both material and spiritual, intact. The role of horses in Scythian burial practices is a reflection of the centrality of horses to Scythian life. The Scythians were masters of horseback riding, and their military tactics revolved around the use of mounted archery. The ability to move swiftly and strike with deadly accuracy from horseback gave the Scythians a distinct advantage on the battlefield. Their reputation as fierce warriors was in part built on their mastery of the horse, and just as the horse played a central role in their wars, it also played a central role in their spirituality and understanding of the afterlife. But the horse's importance extended beyond the battlefield and the burial mound. The Scythians' deep connection to their horses was also reflected in their art. Gold and silver artifacts, many of which depict horses in motion, were common in Scythian graves. These works of art not only celebrated the beauty and strength of the horse, but also conveyed its spiritual significance. The Scythians believed that the horse embodied the very essence of freedom and power, qualities that were essential to their identity as warriors and nomads. Horses were not just animals. They were symbols of the Scythian way of life, a life that was both mobile and fierce, always in motion and always connected to the earth beneath. In some of the more elaborate tombs, the remains of the horses have been found so well preserved that archaeologists are able to reconstruct much of their harnesses and decorations. These artifacts are invaluable, not just for their artistic beauty, but for what they reveal about Scythian culture. The intricacy of the horse gear, the richness of the burial goods, and the meticulousness with which the horses were laid to rest, all point to a people who had a deep respect for their animals. These horses were not just part of the material world, they were part of the spiritual realm, essential to ensuring that the deceased could travel safely to the afterlife. In this way, the horse in Scythian culture was not simply a symbol of power, but a bridge between the worlds. The horse was a living creature, but it was also a spiritual companion, one that could guide its master into the afterlife and serve as a companion in the world beyond. Through the horses that accompanied them into death, the Scythians ensured that their warriors and kings would never truly be alone, even in the vast, silent unknown of the afterlife. As we dig deeper into the tombs of the Scythians, we uncover a world that is as complex and multifaceted as the people who created it. The horses buried with the dead are not just offerings to the gods. They are symbols of a belief system that saw the physical and spiritual worlds as intertwined, where the journey to the afterlife was a continuation of the journey of life. The Scythians, in their profound understanding of the horse and its sacred role, left behind a legacy that echoes in the quiet of the tombs. where the bones of the dead lie alongside the bones of the horses that once carried them, as much as the tombs of the Scythians offer us a glimpse into their lives. The art and artifacts found within them reveal even more about their complex society. The Scythians were not just fierce warriors, they were also skilled artisans, creating works of remarkable beauty and intricate craftsmanship, from gold jewelry to finely decorated weapons. Their art was a reflection of their culture, a blend of warrior spirit, nomadic freedom, and deep spirituality. But beyond the beauty of their works, the symbols and motifs they used speak volumes about their worldview, their values, and their beliefs. One of the most distinctive features of Scythian art is the prevalence of animal motifs, whether in the form of jewelry, weapons, or the decoration of their tombs. Animals were a central theme in Scythian artistic expression. These motifs were not merely decorative, they carried deep symbolic meaning. The Scythians had a profound connection to the natural world, and animals were seen as representations of power, freedom, and the forces of nature that shaped their lives. Predatory animals, such as lions, tigers, and wolves, were often depicted in their art, symbolizing strength, courage, and ferocity, qualities that were highly valued in Scythian culture. In particular, the Scythians had a special reverence for the horse. Horses were not just companions in life and death, but symbols of power and spiritual significance. They were often depicted in their art, not as simple creatures, but as majestic, almost divine beings. The horse's role as a symbol of freedom and strength is reflected in the intricate designs found on Scythian artifacts, particularly in their gold work. Gold horse head plates adorned with intricate engravings and patterns were commonly found in Scythian tombs, suggesting that the horse was central to their spiritual identity. In addition to horses, other animals that represented the Scythians' connection to the natural world, such as stags, deer, and birds, were commonly featured in their art. These animals were often depicted in motion, as if they were caught in the act of running, flying, or hunting. This sense of movement, captured in the design of their jewelry, weapons, and sculptures, reflects the Scythians' dynamic and nomadic way of life. It was not just about the animals themselves, but about their power and vitality qualities that the Scythians aspired to embody. The Scythian use of gold in their art is particularly striking. They were renowned for their goldsmithing skills, creating delicate pieces of jewelry, armor, and ceremonial items. Gold rings, bracelets, necklaces, and earrings were often found in the graves of the elite, each piece meticulously crafted to display the wealth and status of the deceased. The level of craftsmanship in these items suggests a highly sophisticated culture, one that valued artistry as much as it did martial prowess. The use of gold, which was associated with the divine and with immortality, also speaks to the Scythian belief in the afterlife. The intricate, often symbolic designs in these gold pieces were not just for ornamentation. They were meant to connect the living to the divine, to offer protection, and to ensure the journey to the next life would be guided by the god. One of the most iconic and mysterious forms of Scythian art is the animal style art that decorated their weapons and armor. These designs, known for their fluid, dynamic shapes and interlocking forms, depict animals often in combat or dynamic poses, illustrating the Scythian warrior's connection to both the natural and spiritual worlds. The art often features animals whose bodies are intertwined in a continuous flow, creating an almost hypnotic effect. These motifs were particularly common on Scythian weaponry, such as sword hilts, arrowheads, and scabbards. The use of animals in this way suggests that the Scythians saw their warriors as not only human, but also deeply connected to the animal world, wild, untamed, and unstoppable. In addition to the animal motifs, The Scythians also used a variety of abstract symbols in their art. These symbols, often geometric in nature, were used to decorate weapons, pottery, and even the walls of their tomb. While their exact meanings remain a subject of debate, it is clear that these symbols held deep spiritual significance. They were likely intended to invoke the protection of the gods, to mark important rituals, or to represent the forces of nature that governed the Scythians' nomadic existence. The precise meanings of these symbols may be lost to time, but their presence in Scythian art speaks to a culture that believed deeply in the power of the supernatural and the need to honor the forces that shaped their world. One of the most remarkable discoveries in Scythian tombs is the presence of elaborate gold and bronze vessels, often decorated with intricate animal motifs and symbolic patterns. These vessels were likely used in religious ceremonies, possibly for offerings or sacrifices to the gods. The craftsmanship of these objects is exceptional, suggesting that the Scythians were not only warriors but also skilled artisans with a deep appreciation for beauty and detail. These items also serve as a reminder of the importance of ritual in Scythian life. For a people who lived in constant motion, the rituals surrounding death, the afterlife, and the honoring of their gods were vital to their spiritual well-being. The art and symbolism of the Scythians provide us with a window into their culture, their values, and their beliefs. Through their depictions of animals, their use of gold, and their intricate designs, the Scythians sought to communicate their deep connection to the natural world and the divine forces that governed their lives. Their art was not just for decoration, it was a reflection of their worldview. A worldview that saw the sacred and the mundane as intertwined. The Scythians did not live in isolation from the world around them. They saw themselves as part of a larger cosmic order, one in which the forces of nature, the animals, and the gods all played an integral role. As we continue to uncover the art and symbols of the Scythians, we gain a deeper understanding of who they were as a people. They were not just warriors. They were a culture defined by their spirituality, their craftsmanship, and their connection to the natural world. The art they left behind, preserved in tombs, on weapons, and in the intricate designs of their burial goods, speaks to a culture that valued both strength and beauty, that honored its dead, and that believed in the eternal power of the divine. In the quiet of the tombs, where the Scythians' treasures remain undisturbed, we hear the faint echoes of their world, whispers carried on the wind of the steppe, waiting to tell their stories once more. One of the most intriguing and often chilling aspects of Scythian burial practices is the role of sacrifice. For the Scythians, death was not just a natural end, but a transformative journey, and their rituals surrounding death reflected a belief in the need to ensure that the deceased had everything they needed for their passage into the afterlife. To achieve this, they believed that sacrifices, often of animals and in some cases of humans, were necessary to ensure the safety, comfort, and spiritual well-being of the dead as they made their way to the next world. Sacrifices were an integral part of Scythian culture, and these rituals reflected their deep reverence for the afterlife. It was believed that the spirit of the deceased would need to be protected and accompanied by certain objects or beings to help them transition into the world beyond. Horses were a common sacrifice, as they were seen as essential companions for the journey, enabling the dead to travel in the afterlife as they had in life. But it wasn't just animals that were sacrificed. The Scythians also believed that certain human sacrifices were necessary to ensure the deceased's safe passage. These human sacrifices were often servants, warriors, or concubines, individuals who would accompany the king or ruler into the afterlife. The burial practices of the Scythian elites, particularly those of kings, are the most well-documented examples of sacrificial rites. These tombs, often larger and more elaborate than those of commoners, reveal a great deal about how the Scythians viewed the relationship between life, death, and the spiritual world. When a king or high-ranking warrior died, it was not just the body that was prepared for burial, but also the spirit, which required not only material goods, but the company of those who had served them in life. One of the most famous examples of human sacrifice in Scythian tombs is found in the so-called royal kurgans, where the tombs of kings and high-ranking warriors have been discovered, often with multiple sacrificed individuals. In one particularly striking example, the tomb of a Scythian king contained not only the body of the ruler, but also the bodies of servants, soldiers, and possibly a wife or concubine, all arranged carefully around the king. These individuals were likely killed as part of the royal burial ritual, ensuring that they could continue to serve their master in the afterlife. The exact methods of sacrifice are not always clear, but some archaeological evidence suggests that the sacrifices may have been carried out in a ritualistic manner, sometimes involving the strangling or decapitation of the victims. In other cases, evidence of ceremonial weapons, such as daggers or ceremonial knives, has been found alongside the remains of the sacrificed individuals, suggesting that these deaths were seen as sacred acts rather than simple executions. The idea behind these sacrifices was to ensure that the deceased king would have retainers, warriors, and companions in the afterlife, just as he had in life. While the human sacrifices in the Scythian kurgans might seem brutal by modern standards, they were part of a broader worldview that saw death as a continuation of life, not an end. For the Scythians, the deceased did not simply vanish from the world, but were transformed and transported into a new realm, one where they would continue to hold power and influence. The sacrificial rites were designed to ensure that the deceased had the support and protection they would need in this new life, with the faithful servants accompanying their king as guardians in the spiritual realm. Animals, particularly horses, were also an important part of Scythian sacrificial practices. Horses were vital to the Scythians' nomadic lifestyle and warfare, and as such, they were believed to play a crucial role in the afterlife. The presence of horses in the tombs, sometimes buried alongside their masters, reflected the belief that these animals would help the deceased navigate the next world, just as they had in life. In many royal kurgans, horses were sacrificed and laid to rest beside the body of their master, ensuring that the king would have everything he needed for his journey into the afterlife. The horses were often buried with elaborate decorations, such as gold fittings, saddles, and harnesses, suggesting that they were considered sacred beings in their own right. The Scythians also believed in the importance of offering food and drink to the deceased, both in life and death. In some tombs, offerings of food, drink, and other ceremonial items were placed alongside the body of the deceased, perhaps to ensure that they would have sustenance for their journey. These items were often crafted with care, demonstrating the Scythians' belief in the power of ritual and the importance of maintaining the relationship between the living and the dead. Rituals of sacrifice and burial were deeply ingrained in the Scythian worldview, reflecting a belief in the fluidity between life and death. For the Scythians, death was not a permanent end, but a continuation of life, a transformation into another realm where the deceased could still interact with the living. The sacrifices, whether human or animal, were meant to ensure that the king or warrior would be properly prepared for this transition, that they would have everything they needed for the journey, and that their power would continue beyond the grave. The practice of human sacrifice among the Scythians was not universal. The sacrifices were typically reserved for the elite, the kings, and the warriors who had achieved great status and prestige. For the common people, the rituals surrounding death were simpler, but still involved offerings of food, weapons, and other grave goods. Even in these more modest tombs, there is evidence of a deep reverence for the deceased and a belief that the dead could continue to influence the living. The Scythians' view of death as a continuation of life was a reflection of their nomadic way of life, a life where mobility, survival, and spiritual belief were intertwined. As we uncover more about the Scythian sacrificial rites, we begin to see that their culture was one of paradoxes: fierce warriors who believed in peace in the afterlife, conquerors who honored their servants, and individuals who saw death as a bridge rather than an end. The tombs they left behind, with their elaborate burial practices, their animal and human sacrifices, and their intricate offerings, are windows into a world that was at once brutal and reverent, where the living and the dead coexisted in a complex dance of continuity. In the cold, silent tombs, where the body of a warrior lies next to the horse that once carried him into battle, the Scythians' beliefs echo through the centuries. Their rituals, though ancient, are still alive in the artifacts they left behind, waiting to speak to us of a world where the dead lived alongside the living, where the sacrifices of the past ensured the survival of the soul in the afterlife. The Scythians, with their nomadic lifestyle and warrior ethos, left a deep and lasting imprint on the history of the Eurasian steppe and beyond. Their influence extended far beyond their time, as they interacted with neighboring civilizations, inspired later cultures, and left behind a legacy that has shaped the world we know today. Though their empire eventually faded into history, swallowed up by the forces of time, conquest, and change, the echoes of their civilization persist in the tombs, artifacts, and stories they left behind. The Scythian warriors were famous for their horsemanship and military prowess. They were among the earliest to master mounted archery, a technique that gave them an unrivaled advantage over their enemies. Their ability to fight from horseback, shooting arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full speed, made them formidable opponents in battle. They were the terror of the ancient world, their reputation for skill and brutality spreading across the vast lands they roamed. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, described them as the most skillful horsemen of the ancient world, and their legacy as warriors was cemented by their strategic brilliance and their mastery of the bow. Scythian influence stretched far beyond their homeland. They interacted with, and often clashed with, the great empires of their time, including the Persian Empire, the Greek city-states, and the Chinese. The Scythians, with their nomadic way of life, were able to move swiftly across vast distances, engaging in trade, diplomacy, and warfare. They served as middlemen in the ancient world, facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies between the East and West. Through their interactions with other cultures, the Scythians left an indelible mark on the history of the ancient world. The Scythians' ability to influence and adapt to different cultures is evident in the artifacts they left behind. Their tombs are filled with goods that reflect both their own cultural traditions and the influences of neighboring civilizations. Scythian warriors were often buried with weapons that were not only of local design, but also of foreign origin, reflecting the diverse cultures with which they interacted. The gold and silver jewelry found in their tombs often combines elements of Scythian and Greco-Persian styles, suggesting that the Scythians were not just conquerors but also cultural adapters, taking the best from the civilizations they encountered and incorporating it into their own way of life. One of the most remarkable aspects of Scythian culture was its art. The Scythians' artistic legacy is embodied in the goldwork found in their tombs. These pieces, often depicting animals in dynamic, interwoven forms, reflect the Scythians' deep connection to the natural world and their reverence for the animal spirits that they believed guided and protected them. These intricate designs, known as animal style art, can be seen not only in jewelry and weapons, but also in the decorations of the tombs themselves. The fluidity and motion captured in these designs are a testament to the Scythians' ability to blend artistry with their warrior culture. The symbolism of animals, especially predatory ones like tigers, lions, and wolves, represented strength, ferocity, and spiritual power, qualities that the Scythians admired and aspired to embody. Beyond the arts, the Scythians' spiritual beliefs also left a lasting legacy. Their view of death, the afterlife, and the role of the ancestors in guiding the living were central to their worldview. The kurgans, the burial mounds, were not just tombs, they were sacred spaces that connected the living with the dead. The Scythians believed that the spirits of their ancestors continued to watch over them, and the rituals associated with burial were designed to honor and appease these spirits. The sacrifices, the gold offerings, the horses, all were part of a larger ritual that ensured the deceased would be honored and protected in the afterlife, but also that the living would continue to receive the blessings and guidance of those who had gone before. The Scythians' influence on later cultures is evident in the development of other nomadic peoples, particularly those who lived in the steppes of Central Asia. The horse culture that the Scythians perfected was passed down through generations, influencing the Huns, the Mongols, and even the Turkic peoples. The military tactics of mounted archery, honed by the Scythians, became a hallmark of these later nomadic empires. The Mongol Empire, in particular, drew heavily on Scythian practices, with Genghis Khan's horsemen employing the same speed and maneuverability that had made the Scythians so feared and admired. In addition to their military influence, the Scythians also contributed to the cultural and economic exchanges that shaped the ancient world. The Scythian trade networks stretched from the Mediterranean to Central Asia, facilitating the movement of goods and ideas. They acted as intermediaries between the East and the West, playing a crucial role in the Silk Road trade. The goods they traded, including furs, horses, and precious metals, were highly prized, and the Scythians' control of key trade routes made them essential to the economies of many ancient empires. Despite their formidable presence, the Scythian culture eventually faded. By the 4th century BCE, the Scythian Empire had been weakened by internal strife, invasion, and the encroachment of more powerful neighbors. The rise of the Sarmatians, a people closely related to the Scythians, and the eventual dominance of the Roman Empire in the west and the Persian Empire in the east, led to the decline of the Scythian way of life. Their political structures collapsed, and their once dominant warrior class was slowly absorbed into other cultures. But even as their political power waned, the legacy of the Scythians lived on. The art, culture, and military tactics of the Scythians influenced the nomadic empires that followed, shaping the history of Central Asia for centuries to come. The artifacts and tombs they left behind continue to fascinate scholars and archaeologists, offering valuable insights into the lives of these ancient people. The frozen tombs, with their golden treasures, preserved bodies, and symbols of power, continue to tell the story of a civilization that was both fierce and sophisticated. A people who lived with an unwavering belief in the spiritual power of the land and the animals that roamed it. The Scythians may have disappeared as a political force, but their story is far from forgotten. Their tombs, their artifacts, and their art remain as silent witnesses to a people who once shaped the vast stretches of the Eurasian steppe, and as long as their burial mounds stand, their legacy will endure, carried by the whispers of the wind across the steppe, by the shimmering gold of their treasures, and by the echoes of their warriors, who continue to ride, even in death, through the landscape they once ruled. as the Scythian Empire faded into the annals of history, swallowed by time and the changing tides of power. Their once vast presence on the Eurasian steppe slowly diminished. Yet, for a civilization that once spanned such a vast expanse, their legacy has endured far beyond their disappearance. Preserved in artifacts, tombs, and the oral histories of those who succeeded them, the Scythians, though they no longer dominate the lands they once roamed, continue to intrigue and fascinate both scholars and lay people alike, with their complex blend of war, art, and spiritual belief. The decline of the Scythians is a story marked by the rise of other powers. The Sarmatians, a group closely related to the Scythians and the Romans, who steadily encroached upon their territory. But the question of why the Scythians faded remains a subject of historical speculation. Did they simply fall victim to the greater powers of the time, or did they succumb to internal decline? Historians have long debated the nature of their disappearance, and while some suggest a direct conquest by the Sarmatians or the Romans, others point to internal strife, cultural assimilation, and the changes in the dynamics of the nomadic lifestyle as contributing factors. What is certain is that by the 4th century BCE, the Scythians as a distinct political force were no longer the power they once were. The Sarmatians, who emerged in the wake of the Scythians' decline, absorbed many aspects of Scythian culture, including their military tactics and art forms. The horsemen of the Sarmatians continued the traditions of mounted archery perfected by the Scythians, and they too became known for their skill in battle. Over time, however, the Sarmatians, like the Scythians before them, would be gradually overtaken by larger empires, particularly the Romans. By the time the Romans conquered much of the Scythian homeland, the unique cultural and political identity of the Scythians had largely disappeared, replaced by the growing influence of these more powerful neighbors. Yet, despite their disappearance as a dominant force, the Scythians' cultural and artistic influence did not vanish. The art they left behind, particularly the gold jewelry, weapons, and intricately designed animal motifs, has continued to captivate historians, archaeologists, and art lovers alike. Their artifacts have been excavated from burial mounds across the Eurasian steppe, revealing a people who, despite their warlike nature, possessed an extraordinary sense of artistry and craftsmanship. The fine goldwork and dynamic animal art of the Scythians have influenced later cultures, particularly those of the nomadic steppe, and their legacy can be seen in the art of the Turkic, Mongol, and other Central Asian peoples. One of the key ways the Scythians' legacy has persisted is through their impact on the cultures of the nomadic tribes that followed them. The Mongols, in particular, inherited much from the Scythians, including their mastery of mounted archery and their reverence for the horse as both a spiritual and practical companion. The Mongol Empire, under the leadership of Genghis Khan, would later rise to become one of the largest empires in history, and their military strategies, developed by the Scythians centuries before, would help shape the course of world history. The Scythians' influence on the Mongols is a testament to the lasting power of their way of life. Furthermore, the Scythians' complex burial rituals, which included sacrifices, offerings, and the symbolic importance of the tombs, continued to influence later burial practices in Central Asia. Their kurgans, though abandoned and often forgotten by the world for centuries, still stand as solemn reminders of their world. Even today, these ancient burial mounds can be seen scattered across the steppes, marking the landscape like silent sentinels, watching over the land they once ruled. The tombs, many of which are still being uncovered, continue to yield treasures and secrets, adding to our understanding of this enigmatic culture. In the modern world, the Scythians have become symbolic figures in the broader narrative of ancient history. They are remembered not only for their military prowess, but also for their artistry, their spiritual beliefs, and their contributions to the rich tapestry of the cultures that arose on the Eurasian steppe. The Scythians may have vanished as a political entity, but their cultural and spiritual legacy remains alive in the artifacts they left behind, and in the people who followed in their footsteps. For the modern world, the Scythians remain a mysterious and compelling presence, a culture of warriors who lived on horseback, who believed in the eternal power of their ancestors, and whose art and rituals reflected a deep connection to both the earth and the spiritual realm. Their tombs, filled with gold, weapons, and animals, continue to tell their story long after their empire has faded. These tombs, frozen in time beneath layers of permafrost, speak to us across the millennia, offering us a glimpse into a world that was once vibrant, fierce, and alive with spiritual meaning. The Scythians, whose story was once whispered by the wind across the endless steppe, continue to echo through the centuries. As we uncover their tombs, their treasures, and their art, we hear their frozen murmurs, telling the tale of a people who lived boldly, honored their ancestors, and left behind a legacy that still resonates today. May this story settle in your heart like a whisper, and may your dreams be calm and kind. Good night.